Chapter 847. Under the dim light of the fire, Luke carried Redmond and kept running. The shouts of the crowd were getting closer and closer. His footsteps became heavier and heavier, and his breathing became heavier. This wasn't just because he kept running, but also because of the bloodstains on the road behind him. It was because of this that more and more people were chasing after him. No matter where he ran, he couldn't shake them off. But Luke didn't have time to clean up these traces, because he was injured, and it wasn't light. After all, he was a long-range archer. Even though he wasn't weak with a sword, he still couldn't compare to Michaud and David, who were experts in close combat. It wasn't easy for him to cut a bloody path through the crowd to get here. But Luke was obviously very dissatisfied with the result. Damn it! Why are there more and more people? Something must be wrong. Although we did take a detour, my choice of route wasn't wrong. Taking advantage of the chaos to escape was the best way. Oh right, there was so much fighting nearby just now. There were beams of light shooting into the sky and magic light swords. Damn. Boss must have made a big move there and got us killed. Sigh, what did Boss say about you? Keep a low profile, keep a low profile. Isn't that what you always say? His long-winded complaints weren't far from the truth. The reason why Luke and Redmond broke into the most chaotic area of the school was to take advantage of the chaos here to escape. But although it was indeed chaotic here, it also made Luke, who had a bad sense of direction, confused and disoriented, and made a lot of unnecessary detours. When Redmond couldn't stand it anymore and pointed out the way, they ran into the guards who had just left the office building and were chased all the way here. From this perspective, it was indeed Tang En who unintentionally got them killed. Of course, their own luck wasn't that good either. Luke, why don't you put me down and run yourself? I'm useless anyway. Pfft. What are you talking about? Are you trying to slap me in the face? I'm a man of my word. If I say I'll take you out, I'll definitely take you out. Huff. Do you think those small fries behind us can stop me? Pfft, I'm just playing with them. When I catch my breath, huff, I'll take care of them in a flash. Although he was panting for breath, his words weren't very convincing. But Luke had indeed found a place to catch his breath. It was a narrow path between two conjoined buildings. It was extremely dark, and would be hard to notice if one wasn't observant. Thankfully, archers had always had good eyesight, not to mention Luke's innate eyesight. Thus, he still found this place in his panic. He hurriedly cleaned up his tracks and hid inside. After a while, the sound of footsteps could be heard. Where are they? The bloodstains disappeared here, so they must be nearby. Let's go and search these two buildings. After the hasty shout, the sound of footsteps gradually disappeared, followed by the sound of a door being smashed one after another from the side of the building. Sticking his head out slightly, Luke looked around with delight. Aha, a bunch of small fries want to catch me? How naive. Old Lay, don't you think so? Redmond, who was behind him, didn't agree. He just stared blankly at the back of the path. Luke turned his head in dissatisfaction and subconsciously followed his line of sight, only to be stunned. Who are you? The two ends of the path were connected. Luke and Redmond were standing on one end, and the shout had come from the other side. In his blurry vision, he could see several figures running out of the darkness with spears in their hands. It's over. Redmond's expression turned bitter. In this academy, as long as one had a spear, there was no doubt that they were temple knights. At that moment, whoosh! There was a sharp whistle in the air. As if struck by lightning, the person who had shouted first was sent flying backward, instantly pressing down on the figures behind him. But it was already too late. Following the shout, the two buildings on both sides suddenly fell silent. Clearly, the pursuers had noticed them. Putting down his longbow, Luke shook his head and sighed. He turned around and sincerely said, "You said you would let me run first. Does that still count?" At the edge of the square. Here, you're present. Sylvia stared blankly at the bloody palm, momentarily speechless. Not long ago, Tang En had promised to give her a present. At that time, she hadn't thought much about it. She had never thought that Tang En would actually fulfill his promise and give her his palm. From a logical point of view, she had vaguely guessed that Tang En's actions had a deeper meaning, and that giving her his palm was just a convenient thing to do. But now, the reality was that he had promised to give her a present, and she hadn't refused. Then, he had gone up to the heavens to fight to the death, and in the end, he had given her his present while covered in wounds. As long as you want it, as long as I have it, I'll do my best, I'll do my best. Sylvia was also a woman, even if she could do things that most men couldn't. But in terms of biological structure, she was still a woman. And this scene was like a scene from a fairy tale, enough to make any woman's stomach turn and let their imagination run wild. Tang En didn't think much about it. It wasn't that he wasn't observant enough, but that Sylvia was an ancient tyrannosaurus in his heart. She was already far beyond the category of a woman, so he wouldn't think in that direction at all. Tang En couldn't help but scratch his head when he saw that Sylvia didn't react for a long time with his palm raised. He wondered if the meaning of his present was bad. No matter what, the other party had put in a lot of effort to send him up to the heavens, which allowed him to achieve the goal he had in his heart. But in the end, he had given her a bloody broken palm. It seemed a little unreliable. All right, this thing is indeed a little bloody, and it doesn't look good. But no matter what, this is still the palm of a magus. It's not commonly seen, so it still has a certain collectible value. Oh right, isn't there a gem here? Tang En's eyes suddenly lit up. He waved his dagger, and in no time, he dug out the huge magic crystal at the top of the magic staff. He stuffed it into Sylvia's hand as if he was presenting a treasure, and let out a sigh of relief. This is great. This thing looks like it's worth a lot of money. How is it, am I generous enough? This is definitely generous enough. In the sky, Sasori had just endured the pain and cast a spell to stop the bleeding when he saw the legendary magic staff that had accompanied him for hundreds of years being torn apart in an instant. He couldn't help but spit out a mouthful of old blood, and he cried out in pain like an owl crying. After coming back to her senses, Sylvia subconsciously avoided Tang En's gaze and reached out to put away the huge magic crystal. She steadied her mind and said calmly, "It's SOSO. Oh, as expected of the Flower of Nights, so generous." Tang En gave her a thumbs up when he heard this, his expression full of admiration. Then, taking advantage of this short rest, he quickly panted a few times. There was a sudden crackling sound around his body, and the bones that were previously dislocated instantly returned to their normal positions. As for those that were broken, they could only be put aside for now. Wiping the cold sweat from his forehead, Tang En stood up again and straightened his body. He estimated his injuries, which were more or less life-threatening, but not in a good state. What do we do now? As long as she set her goal, Sylvia never cared about other people's opinions. But now that her mood was a little chaotic, it was just the right time to change the topic. Tang En narrowed his eyes and looked at the two people in the sky who were gradually approaching. He spread out his hands and said righteously, "Is there a need to say it? Since we have taken advantage of it, the next thing is of course to run away." Sylvia was stunned when she heard this, and then she only thought that Tang En had the intention to retreat. She nodded and said, "Then you go first." After saying that, she raised her spear and was about to rush toward Rode, who was sitting on the ground in the distance. Wait. Tang En quickly pulled Sylvia and said, not knowing whether to laugh or cry, "What are you doing? Even if you want to die, you don't have to do it like this. Let's go, cooperate with me and run away first. As for that Rode, I'll deal with him later." Sylvia hesitated and looked at Tang En. "Do you have a plan?" Throwing the broken palm, Tang En did not deny or admit it. He just smiled and said, "Everything depends on it." Then he turned around and raised his broken palm towards Cecily and the others who were slowly approaching in the air. "Haha, look over here. Do you want to go back?" Cecily suddenly stopped when he saw this. He looked at Tang En with eyes that were about to burst into flames. However, he also knew that as long as he did not want to become disabled, the initiative was now in the hands of the other party. He raised his head and took a deep breath. After a moment, he said in a deep voice, "What do you want?" Tang En smiled softly and released his palm. "I want you to be sad." After saying that, the blade light bloomed brilliantly like a pear flower. After a flash, the broken palm, which was still intact just now, had now turned into shredded flesh and bone fragments that could not be any more broken. They fell down in a large amount. This scene was beyond the expectations of everyone present. After all, he had just put on a show of wanting to negotiate. Who would have thought that he would actually play this? After a pause, he suddenly screamed hysterically. I want you to die. I want you to be torn into pieces. Not bones left." Chapter 848. No one was willing to become disabled. Even an old man who did not have much time left would want to return with dignity. Therefore, after Tang En chopped up the broken palm, it was equivalent to cutting off all his escape routes. Cecily was crazy, Brock was furious, and a new round of crazy pursuit that went straight to the white-hot stage was instantly staged. From this moment on, the dim twilight above the academy continued to shine brightly. The holy spear light that contained divine fighting energy and all kinds of magic that dazzled people's eyes. Numerous and diverse, it pressed down like a storm, completely showing a crushing momentum. The high-rise building collapsed into inconspicuous ruins in an instant. The flat square was instantly shattered into a mess. Cecily went crazy. In his crimson vision, there were only 2 figures of ants that appeared from time to time below. As for the rest, whether it was the garrison cavalry or the Divinity Temple Knights, as long as they blocked the attack route, they were all destroyed with a wave of his hand. F***ck, this old man is crazy. Seeing a small group of Divinity Temple Knights directly submerged in the fiery red lotus, Tang En, who originally wanted to go over and take a breath, suddenly had a bitter expression on his face. He grinned and was speechless. Nonsense. Phew. Sylvia's speed was originally not as fast as Tang En's, and now she was panting under the heavy pressure. Hearing this, she immediately rolled her eyes and said angrily, "You chopped up the hand and you still don't allow people to go crazy?" He turned around to take a look, and his expression immediately changed. He leaped out and shouted anxiously, "Judgment Light Staff, mid-level area of effect magic. Hide at least 6 feet away." Tang En heard this and quivered. He did not have time to argue. He jumped sideways, landed on the ground, rolled, and flashed 100 feet away in an instant. As soon as the 2 of them left, a holy staff quickly fell. With a bang, a circular shock wave rippled out layer by layer. The originally flat bluestone ground instantly turned into a scorched pit with a diameter of 6 to 7 feet. Not daring to look back, the 2 of them merged again and ran wildly. This was their current cooperation. Tang En was responsible for pointing out the escape route with precise control of a small area. Sylvia, on the other hand, relied on her familiarity with the magic of the temple to list out the names of the attacks, the damage, and the safe distance to avoid them. It had to be said that Tang En and Sylvia were indeed the most suitable partners, especially in the face of enemies from the Divine Hall. If it weren't for Tang En, even if Sylvia was extremely familiar with the attack and could accurately avoid the attack range, she would still be forced into a dead end while constantly running away. Without Sylvia, even though Tang En would not have a problem escaping, it would undoubtedly be very difficult for him to carry out his next plan. Fortunately, they were now collaborators. In this way, they formed the running combination that made Brock and the other 2 furious. Just a little bit more every time. The 2 of them hated the fact that there were too few experts who came this time. If there were two more, no, another expert of their level, they would definitely be able to block these two ants who were fleeing in all directions and then tear them into pieces to vent their anger. Unfortunately, there were only two of them, and Byron and the others were not of much use. Therefore, even though they were already invincible magisters and void warriors, they could only chase after the other party now. It seemed like they were taking the initiative, but they were also passive and helpless. Whether it was Tang En, Sylvia, Brock, or Cecily, their speed was undoubtedly extremely astonishing. In just a short while, they arrived at the back of the academy with the momentum of a bombardment. Among them, who knew how many innocent passing souls floated up, and the destroyed buildings were innumerable, at this moment, Tang En, who was running wildly, suddenly paused and hurriedly stopped his charge. In the sky, Cecily, who was already in a killing frenzy, was overjoyed when he saw this. Without thinking, he raised his only arm and quickly chanted a few obscure syllables, about to release a large-scale magic to cover the area. But before his arm fell, a long spear blocked in front of him first. "Wait, calm down." Brock frowned and motioned for the crazy Brock to look down. The latter stared fiercely at Brock for a few seconds, then reluctantly looked away. He lowered his head and couldn't help but frown. Below, in front of Tang En and Selena, there was a large group of nearly 70 to 80 people from the temple blocking their way. Both sides were clearly unprepared for this encounter. They stopped in their tracks and stared at each other. In the previous crazy bombardment, although some people from the temple had been affected, there were no more than 10 people at most, and most of them were only 1 or 2 people. Now that there were nearly 100 people from the temple here, Brock naturally couldn't let Cecily bombard at will, or the consequences would be unimaginable. Although the temperature had dropped slightly, how could Cecily's hatred for his broken palm be so easily appeased? After frowning, he roared angrily, "Get out of the way, all of you get out of the way!" With the strength of Tang En and Selena, this ordinary team of 100 people naturally couldn't stop them. Instead, it would tie up their hands and feet, so Cecily simply roared for these people to make way. At this moment, on the ground, they shouted in surprise, "Boss! Your Excellency Tang En! Look, Raymond! You guys are F***ck, boss, I finally found you. If I was a little later, you really wouldn't have been able to see me." Luke, who was covered in bruises, suddenly saw Tang En. He was overjoyed at first, but then his face turned gloomy, as if saying, "Who dares to be more miserable than me?" Tang En was stunned. Then, he looked past the two of them and saw the murderous 100-man temple team not far away. He immediately understood the current situation and decisively stretched out his hand. "Give me Raymond. You think of a way to run first." Boss, you can't be so disloyal." Luke's expression became even more bitter. "I really can't run anymore. Take me with you." The corner of Tang En's mouth twitched. Then, he pointed at the sky with a faint smile. "Are you sure? Do you see those 2 old men? One is a real void warrior, and the other is a crazy magus. You still want me to take you with me?" Luke opened his mouth and looked up blankly. The next moment, he quickly pushed Raymond to Tang En and turned to run. "Boss, take care of yourself. I think I'm in good shape. I won't be a burden to you. See you later, hee." Sylvia, who was looking at the sky, glanced at him and couldn't help but chuckle. "Your subordinate," she grinned. "What do you think?" Pondering for a moment, she said, He has a personality." Tang En nodded in agreement. Then, he grabbed Raymond's shoulder and sighed. "Yes, he's just a little lacking in humanity. They're all beasts." After joking, Luke quickly ran away. Not far away, the church team listened to Cecily's order and hesitated before making way. They didn't chase after him. Tang En and Selena naturally wouldn't waste any time here. Although Cecily was suppressing his attacks because of the 100-man team, it didn't mean that he would stay like this forever. If Tang En and Selena didn't leave, they might be greeted with a merciless bombardment of spells. They continued to run. The difference was that the team had changed from 2 to 3 people. With one more burden, the situation naturally became even more difficult. The night gradually deepened. At that moment, the school had completely broken away from the temple's control and had turned into a chaotic battlefield. Of course, the gray space wasn't the only one who wanted to fish in troubled waters. The rescue team in the city was also involved, at the back of the school, in the theology hall. With a bang, the door of the auditorium was pushed open, and a group of murderous men charged in, reeking of blood and knives. There was a moment of silence, before 2 screams of pleasant surprise rang out. "Father! Father Sob, you're finally here!" The boys and girls, who were holding wooden sticks and shovels, quickly threw themselves into the arms of the 2 people who had charged in first. The little boy's mental fortitude was slightly worse. He was wiping his eyes and burying himself in the arms of a one-eyed man as he cried. Good, it's good that you're fine. What the F***ck are you crying for? Don't cry." The ones who had barged in were none other than the 2 gang bosses in ancient Wheat City. Taking advantage of the chaotic situation outside, they had scattered lime powder all the way here, allowing them to charge in first. Now that they saw that their children were fine, they were naturally very happy. It was just that when the one-eyed man looked at the calm little girl next to his sworn enemy and then at his son who was crying in his arms, he instantly felt that he had lost face and was a little dissatisfied. They couldn't stay here for long. After discussing it with the old president, the 2 bosses decided to evacuate from the back of the school with all the students. It wasn't chaotic there yet. As long as they found a few more horses to test the location of the magic traps, they would be able to leave this troublesome place in the shortest time possible. Unfortunately, although the plan was good, before they could leave the theology hall, suddenly, there was a stern shout. "Who are you? Stop right there!" Chapter 849. Who are you? Stop. Because they were worried about their children's safety, the 2 bosses were the first rescue team to lead people into the academy. However, this didn't mean that they were the only ones in this area. As half of the academy's owner, the people from the temple were undoubtedly here as well. And now, there was a 5-man team from the temple passing by. The leader was a middle-aged knight with slightly swollen eyes. When he turned around and saw a group of big men hurriedly coming out of the hall, he immediately questioned them and blocked the main entrance with his spear. The 2 bosses didn't want to talk nonsense with him. They directly waved their hands and said domineeringly, "Kill them!" As soon as they finished speaking, dozens of big men rushed out. Their expressions were fierce as they swung their swords. Their movements were very straightforward. Along the way, many knights from the temple had died under their swords. So even if they knew that the other party was good, they weren't afraid at all. However, the team in front of them was obviously different, especially the middle-aged knight with the swollen eyes. Seeing dozens of sharp swords coming at him, he didn't panic. Instead, he became angry. "You're courting death." He stepped forward and waved his spear. His holy do-chi suddenly exploded and instantly sent the big men flying. They spat out blood. "Fuck!" Looking down at the elite fighters under them who fell back to their feet and couldn't get up, the 2 bosses looked at each other and their hearts couldn't help but sink. After years of living on the edge of the blade, they instantly felt danger approaching. This guy seemed to have the strength of a high-level warrior. Most of the people in the gangs were naturally ordinary people. Although their bodies were strong enough and their hearts were ruthless enough, it was rare to see someone who had do-chi. Basically, a few beginner martial artists with a bit of do-chi were enough to support the facade of a not small gang. As for high-level warriors, they definitely didn't dare to think about it. But now that they had met on a narrow path, the 2 big shots had no other choice. They could only wave their hands with gloomy expressions once more and place their hopes on a new object. Very quickly, as the saber lights danced about, The lime powder that had escorted them all the way here made a dazzling appearance once more. In an instant, the door of the theology hall was covered by a white fog. At the same time, kill! The group of burly men became excited when they saw this. They had already simulated this scene many times. They lowered their heads and brandished their swords as they rushed into the white fog. They did not even look at who was in front of them. They only cared about raising their swords and swinging them down. If it was an ordinary knight, no matter how skilled he was, there was a high chance that he would be hit if he was caught off guard. But this time, I'm going to F***CKU. Roaring furiously, the holy light in the white mist suddenly burst out crazily. Layers of spear shadows swept away more than half of the white mist in an instant. At the same time, dozens of burly men were sent flying out at high speed, slamming into the walls and pillars. Blood flowed out of their heads as they howled in pain. With a whoosh, the students at the back couldn't help but scream. The middle-aged knight held his spear and charged out from the faint lime powder. His slightly swollen eyes became even more swollen. They looked like the eyes of a goldfish that were flipped outwards. His eyes were red. You still want to play this trick? You are F***king looking for death. Hearing this rather exasperated roar, the two big shots were first stunned, then their faces were filled with bitterness. It was obvious that this person had already suffered from the lime powder before. Now that he saw it again, he naturally went berserk. This time it was over. The big shot in green took a deep breath, turned his head and roared, "Go back! All of you, go back and block him!" The first half of the sentence was said to the students behind, while the second half was said to the subordinates beside him. However, the middle-aged knight was obviously in a state of extreme anger. He didn't wait for the students to retreat and was about to charge forward with his spear. At this moment, suddenly, boom! The wall a few feet away from the entrance of the theology hall suddenly exploded from the middle. Dirt and rocks flew everywhere, and two dusty figures rolled out of the hall. They looked very pathetic. The hall instantly fell silent. After a pause, shouts of shock and surprise sounded almost at the same time. It's you. Big brother with the shovel." The two big shots looked at the ordinary-looking young man outside the door. He was the one they had unanimously agreed was timid but definitely a genius in the gang. They couldn't help but be stunned. However, the eyes of the boys and girls beside them lit up when they saw the young man. They cheered and shouted in surprise. "Come quickly, big brother, there is a bad guy here." Outside the door, Tang En heard the familiar voices of the children. He turned his head in surprise and found that they were the two bold children he had accidentally saved. The broken shovel was still in their hands. He pondered for a moment and his mind raced. "Wait a moment!" He slapped the ground, and under Sylvia's puzzled gaze, his figure instantly flashed into the hall. "You are..." Before the middle-aged knight could subconsciously ask the question in his heart, Tang En flashed in front of him like a ghost. He didn't say anything, and with a whistling sound, he quickly waved his hand. He was really in a hurry. Cecily and the other two would arrive in an instant. He was so anxious that he didn't even have time to flash his dagger. The middle-aged knight was shocked when he saw this. His body instinctively raised his spear to parry, but this speed was still too slow in front of Tang En. When the spear was raised to his chest, Tang En's palm had already reached his right cheek. With a boom, the knight's figure disappeared from the spot. His entire upper body sank into the thick wall several meters away. It was obvious that he was dead. This small interlude didn't slow down. Tang En instantly arrived in front of the two big shots who were dumbfounded. He casually stuffed Raymond, who he had been carrying in his hand, behind them. He raised his hands and patted the two big shots' shoulders. "Help me take care of him. I know you." Before he finished speaking, his figure flashed again, and he had already disappeared with Sylvia in front of the door. Everything happened in a short moment, but it wasn't until a long time later that the dead silent hall woke up with a sudden scene. In front of the door, the night wind blew, and the remaining 4 ordinary knights suddenly fell to the ground with a thud. No one knew when they had died. They could only guess that their necks had been broken by someone from their obviously twisted heads. Hua! There was an uproar in the hall. In the blink of an eye, 4 strong knights' necks were broken, and then, like swatting a fly, he directly slapped a high-level warrior to death. The 2 big shots looked at each other and thought of their previous intentions of recruiting him. Suddenly, they were sweating profusely, and the pressure was as great as a mountain. Wow, Big Brother's strength is really great. Did you see it just now? Just like that, he directly hit that bad guy into the wall. Humph, you didn't believe me before. I already told you, this is Big Brother's divine weapon, but now it's mine. Haha. Compared to the complicated thoughts of the adults, the 2 children thought much simpler. After coming back to her senses, the little girl imitated the slapping gesture to her friends. She admired Tang En's great strength very much. The little boy hugged the wooden stick tightly, as if he had a divine weapon in his hand and was proud of the world. He wouldn't let go no matter what. This wasn't something that could be done with great strength. He probably had the strength of Earth level or even Void level. The 2 big shots heard this and smiled bitterly, shaking their heads speechlessly. By the way, Father, you know Big Brother, right? The little girl thought of something and said with a hopeful expression, "Can we invite him to our house as a guest?" This. The big shot in green was a little embarrassed. He was about to find an excuse to brush it off when his expression suddenly froze. He first looked at the middle-aged curly-haired man behind him, who was also Redmond, who had a confused expression. Then, he suddenly turned his head and looked at the one-eyed big shot beside him. They both remembered the sentence that Tang En left behind. "Help me take care of. I know you guys." They were all here to make a living, so some things naturally didn't need to be said out loud. Help him take care of this middle-aged curly-haired man. And I know you guys, the subtext was that I can find you guys. So, if you guys play any tricks, you can imagine the consequences. Tang En's general meaning was indeed like that. He had no choice. He definitely had to save Redmond, or else this trip would be meaningless. However, under the strong pursuit of Cecily and Cecily, Tang En could barely bring Redmond along. He couldn't let go of his hands and feet. Now that he finally saw an acquaintance here, he naturally threw him over and asked him to take care of him. Of course, the 2 big shots didn't know the details, nor did they need to know. As long as they understood the meaning of Tang En's words, they would know what to do. Swallowing their saliva, the 2 turned around at the same time and bowed politely to Redmond, who was a little dazed from running around all night. "Hello, Big Brother. How should I address you?" Chapter 850. P.S. Sorry, it's so late. There's a power outage in my hometown, but this chapter is still guaranteed to be 5,000 words long. After sending Raymond off, Tang En was no longer burdened. After flashing out of the theology hall, he put his arm around Sylvia's shoulder and ran at full speed, instantly disappearing at the back of the academy. In just a few short breaths, Cecily and Brock appeared in the sky. Their eyes were like hawks, sweeping back and forth across the dozen or so pitch-black buildings below, their brows slightly furrowed. This location was in the northwest corner of the academy. At a glance, there were no conspicuous tall buildings. Judging from the large warehouse that occupied a large area, this corner should have been used to store sundries when it was planned. Few people came here, and for the time being, they were not affected by the chaos not far away. After a few glances, Cecily and Brock coincidentally set their sights on the periphery of the academy. There was a large ditch there, which was also the main channel for the drainage of the city's garbage. After casting an illumination spell, they could see that the river water was abnormally turbid. Most of it was mud and dry beach. They believed that if they got close, they would be able to smell a faint odor. Other than that, there was no sign of Tang En and Brock, nor were there any obvious traces of trampling. And judging from the time, Cecily and Brock did not think that the other party could have jumped over the ditch and run out of the academy in just a few breaths. So after observing for a while, when the figures of Byron and the others appeared in the distant sky, the two still focused their attention on the building in front of them. At this time, in the pitch-black warehouse, two figures sat slumped in the shadows on both sides of the floor-to-ceiling window, leaning against the wall. Their chests rose and fell, slowly but continuously gasping for breath, blowing up the dust around them. They floated in front of the window, looking unusually quiet under the faint light. All kinds of sundries were piled up around them. There were old desks, heavy saddles, wooden frames for weapons, and other teaching equipment. In the gloomy environment, their sinister outlines were revealed. It seemed that evil deeds had an indescribable sense of horror. "This is your plan, to hide here and wait for death?" In the darkness, Sylvia looked at the things around her, smelling the oppressive and damp smell that lingered in front of her nose, and asked softly with a frown. "Hee, you can't say that." Tang En stroked his chest. The last dash just now had made him a little tired. The corners of his mouth raised slightly. "What if we can really dodge it?" After a moment of silence, "You must be joking. Even if they really don't think that we're hiding here, it's just a few spells. It won't take much time." As soon as he finished speaking, as if confirming Sylvia's deduction, the ground suddenly trembled, and the sound of a violent explosion reverberated in the sealed warehouse. It was as if the explosion had happened right next to them. The two of them instantly got up and looked up at the sky not far away through the trembling crystal glass. Byron and the others were constantly waving their staffs to release all kinds of powerful magic, bombarding the buildings around the warehouse. On the other hand, Cecily and the other two stood apart from each other, their eyes fixed on the bombardment below. If there were any abnormal movements, they would immediately attack. "Tsk Jinx." Tang En smacked his lips and sighed helplessly. Sylvia tightened her grip on the spear in her hand. She looked over and asked in a deep voice, "Tell me, what is your plan?" Xia Weian could be said to understand Twain extremely well. In her opinion, no matter how strong his opponent was, Twain would not resign himself to death and leave his fate to the illusory luck. However, after a short pause, Tang En sighed softly. "You really think highly of me? Well, when I came here, I expected that the temple would send someone strong to deal with me, but I didn't expect them to think so highly of me. A void-level warrior is not enough, they even sent a magus, haha." He looked out the window and smiled bitterly, shaking his head slightly. Sylvia looked at Tang En's serious expression and pursed her lips. She then took a deep breath and turned to the warehouse door. "I will go out from there later. You should get ready." "And? I'm not strong enough, and I don't know how long I can hold them off. I think I should be able to attract their attention for a moment. When the time comes, you can break this glass and leave. With your speed and the chaotic environment here, there is a high chance that you can escape." Pausing for a moment, Xia Weian walked to the side of the dazed Tang En. Seeming to know what he was thinking, Xia Weian said calmly, "There's no reason. Just take it as returning the favor. I don't like to owe people things." She added, turned around, and strode towards the door. Subconsciously grabbing Sylvia's arm, Tang En blinked. "But you owe me 2 favors." Her footsteps paused. Sylvia's free and easy temperament suddenly stagnated. She turned her head and rolled her eyes angrily. She did not expect the other party to be so shameless. Tang En touched his nose when he saw this. He also knew that the words he blurted out were a bit shameless, and could not help but be embarrassed and speechless. The explosions outside the window continued. Under the bombardment of Byron and others, no matter if it was the fragile wooden houses or the solid stone buildings, under the powerful magic, they were all turned into ruins in an instant. It was also because of Cecily's extremely cautious order to ask Byron and the others to blow these buildings into smithereens. Otherwise, it would have been the turn of this large warehouse. Of course, the difference was only a few minutes. Cough, cough. In the warehouse, it was Tang En who finally touched his nose and coughed twice to break the awkward atmosphere. I didn't mean that. I'm returning the favor. Just as Tang En was thinking about what words to use to brush her off, Sylvia pursed her lips and suddenly took a step forward, moving her face closer. Tang En's reaction was absolutely fast. A few feet was his safety line, so although he did not feel any killing intent, he still subconsciously turned his head. Oh, a soft touch. Sylvia's lips, which were originally supposed to fall on Tang En's face, coincidentally kissed the corner of Tang En's mouth because of this action. In an instant, both of their bodies stiffened. There was a faint light from the window lattice, a light dust, and the surrounding rumbling quickly receded like a tide, gradually becoming inaudible. It was as if time had stopped at this moment, and there was no more elegant silence than this. How could a favor be returned like this? Tang En was dumbfounded. His brain, which used to brag about its ability to think at lightning speed, suddenly crashed and stopped working at this moment. Sylvia was also dumbfounded. It was just returning a favor. Why did she impulsively choose this method? Was it because of the previous gift? Was it because she knew she was going to die? Perhaps it was because of the impulse that often appeared in nightmares. Well, it did not matter if it was because of one of the reasons or a combination of all the reasons. In short, Sylvia did this action that even she did not know the meaning of, and then because of Tang En's unintentional cooperation, it instantly created this unexpected beauty. Oh, it was not quite right to say that it was beautiful. Because although this scene could be considered beautiful, it could not stand up to the two of them who were now in a sorry state with their heads and faces covered in dust. When the corners of their mouths touched, besides being stained with dust, there was also a strong smell of blood. It was really a bit of a killjoy. Of course, the two of them would not care about this at the moment. The meaning of a kiss on the face and a kiss on the mouth was, of course, different. Everyone knew this. And it was precisely this meaning that made the passive Tang En shocked and dumbfounded, and made the active Sylvia unable to back down. In the end, the two of them had their thoughts scattered all over the ground. They did not intend to separate, nor did they intend to take another step forward. They just touched each other like this, feeling the faint throbbing in their hearts, completely at a loss and not knowing what to do. It was unknown how much time had passed. Of course, the actual time was at most a few minutes. Suddenly, with a loud crash, along with a violent explosion that was ignored close by, the crystal glass of the floor-to-ceiling window at the side shattered with a loud crash. The sky full of fragments fell under the attack of the airwave and shattered into glass on the ground. Instantly separating, the two of them subconsciously looked out of the window. The surrounding buildings had basically been completely destroyed. They believed that in less than 10 seconds, the magic attack would descend on this warehouse. They turned their heads again and looked at each other. Tang En touched the corner of his mouth with a strange expression, while Sylvia was very calm, as if nothing had happened just now. She even patted Tang En's shoulder and said casually, "Don't think too much, I'm just returning your favor. I said before, I hate owing people things. Now we're even." After saying this, she simply turned around and strode away. Tang En grinned and raised his eyebrows as he looked at Sylvia's calm and composed back. Suddenly, he said, "You're going the wrong way, the door is behind." After answering, Sylvia subconsciously turned around. After taking a few steps, her delicate body suddenly stopped. She looked up at Tang En, who was smiling, and then turned her head slightly stiffly to look at the warehouse door behind her. Suddenly, her face was dyed with a blush at a speed visible to the naked eye. She was embarrassed and annoyed. "Ha ha." Tang En saw this and finally could not help but raise his head and laugh. Sylvia did not go the wrong way before, but immediately changed direction after being reminded of the mistake. This undoubtedly showed that her heart was not as free and easy as it appeared on the surface. On the contrary, she was very absent-minded. Otherwise, she would not have made such a low-level mistake. Ahem, okay, I'm just kidding. Looking at the steel spear in Sylvia's hand creaking, Tang En tactfully stopped laughing. Then, he pursed his lips and patted Sylvia's shoulder. I understand that you're anxious to return the favor, but my favor is not so easy to return. Haha, thank you for your kindness, see you later. Before Sylvia could understand, she suddenly felt her shoulder being tightly clasped. The next moment, with a whoosh, her body flew out rapidly. In her line of sight, Tang En stood by the window and waved his hand with a faint smile on his face. Then, he turned around, took a step forward, and directly came to the broken window. He raised his head and roared, his hair flying in the wind, roar. The roar rumbled and shook the sky. In an instant, it covered the violent explosions around them and also covered the sound of Sylvia smashing the crystal glass on the other side of the warehouse. Whoosh! A cold wind blew, and Sylvia instantly came back to her senses. Only then did she realize that she had already left the warehouse. Under her feet was the muddy ditch, and she was flying quickly to the other side of the bank. Looking up, it was pitch black inside the floor-to-ceiling window from when she came out. Tang En's figure was nowhere to be seen. Looking up, several figures were rapidly gathering in the sky. However, their attention was on the other side of the warehouse, and they did not notice that she was flying silently. With a bang, Sylvia fell heavily on the other side of the ditch. Rolling a few times, she forced herself to stop moving backward. She immediately looked up, and her anxious expression suddenly froze. In the dark night sky of the warehouse, countless dazzling spears fell together like falling stars. Not far away, a pure and majestic holy pillar of light fell from the sky with a loud bang. In addition, there were several dazzling magic lights blooming one after another. All the powerful attacks had only one target, and that was the large steeple warehouse below. No! As soon as she screamed out, it was immediately covered by the violent explosions. Boom! 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 Nothing could withstand such a tyrannical attack, and this large warehouse was no exception. In the continuous terrifying explosions, billowing waves of air rushed to the sky, and the original outline of the warehouse disappeared in an instant. Just from the flying debris of earth and stone, one could imagine what kind of cruel ruins it was inside the waves of air. Opening her mouth, Sylvia did not make any more screams. She quickly pursed her lips and clenched the soil on the ground tightly. Her sharp eyes constantly scanned every corner outside the waves of air. She did not believe that Tang En would die. He was so fast. He was so cunning. He just smiled and said, "I'll see you later." How could he die? Putting aside whether Sylvia's thoughts were reasonable or if she was deceiving herself, the bombardment continued. Perhaps it was out of fear, or perhaps it was out of anger, but Cecily and the others were very ruthless. First, they bombarded the surroundings of the warehouse, and then they shrunk inside layer by layer. In this way, as long as someone was inside, they would definitely die. And more importantly, they would have to run in despair before they died. Then, they would have to stand in the middle of the warehouse and watch the explosions get closer and closer. They would be powerless and could only wait for death, ha. The eerie laughter that sounded like a night owl echoed in the air. Cecily's old face was contorted. He kept casting spells while muttering to himself like a maniac. Run, run, run. Die, die, die. Byron and the others were also unusually excited. Cecily was excited because he had completely lost his hand, while Byron and the others were excited because their lives were in danger. Ever since Tang En appeared in their field of vision, they hadn't had a day of peace. Sometimes they were worried that the Crimson Dagger would suddenly appear in front of them. Other times they were worried that the noose of the Court of Judgment would suddenly descend on their necks. But now, as long as they killed Tang En, they would no longer have any worries about their safety. and at the thought of Tang En dying under their spells, their aged bodies trembled in excitement. It was as though they had miraculously regained their youthful vitality like withered trees in the spring. The attacks on their hands became even more vigorous. Shortly after the bruised and battered road was carried over by a few knights on a makeshift stretcher, the explosions finally subsided completely. It wasn't that Cecily and the others didn't want to bombard anymore, but that they couldn't find a target to bombard. After the dust dispersed, the originally huge warehouse was almost blasted to the ground. There was only a thin layer of ruins that emitted faint smoke everywhere. After patrolling the area in satisfaction, Cecily took the lead and landed in the ruins without hesitation. His thoughts were simple. Regardless of whether Tang En had been blasted into smithereens, he had to confirm it because he had previously said that he would tear Tang En into pieces, just like how his broken palm was shredded into shreds, but it was apparent that even with the convenience of magic, it was still a big project to search for Road. Seeing this, Brock shook his head. He didn't think that it was possible for Road to leave an intact corpse under such an attack. It would be good enough if he could leave a broken limb. But after pondering for a while, he still called for Byron and the others to land together and help Cecily search. Brock knew very well that Cecily had fallen into his inner demons. If he didn't search for Road, he wouldn't be satisfied for the rest of his life. Wait a minute! The only one who disagreed was Road, who had rushed over. When he saw Cecily and the others landing one after another, he hurriedly dissuaded them. "My lords, let me get someone to do this rough work. You just have to wait in the sky." Brock couldn't help but be taken aback when he heard that. Road was obviously still worried that Tang En wasn't dead. He was afraid that they would lose the advantage of flying in the air after landing, which was equivalent to taking the initiative to approach Tang En. The consequences would be unpredictable. Humph! Cecily apparently also thought of Road's concerns. But after letting out a cold snort, he didn't fly into the air as he was told. Instead, he landed directly on the ground. With a wave of his hand, a strong wind raged and instantly lifted a large area of ruins. He squinted his eyes and carefully searched for pieces of flesh and limbs that might exist in it. "Sir." "Sigh." Road raised his only arm and sighed helplessly. "Don't worry, that Tang En can't possibly be alive." Brock flew over and comforted him. He then waved the spear in his hand. "Besides, even if he can miraculously survive, can he trap the two of us on the ground at once? As long as any one of us can fly into the air, he can only escape or die." Road frowned slightly. "I know that too, but somehow, I feel that he is hiding something." "Well, it's okay. Maybe I'm just overthinking." In fact, Road himself didn't think that anyone could survive such an attack just now. But the deep fear in his heart still made Road feel that it was a little strange that Tang En died so easily. Of course, these groundless speculations obviously couldn't convince the crazy Cecily. So in the end, Road just let the few knights carrying the stretcher follow Brock into the ruins to search, so that they could finish the search as soon as possible and leave this place as soon as possible. Although the warehouse area was large, there weren't many ruins left after the violent bombardment. With the help of Cecily, Byron, and other magical means, the search process progressed smoothly by more than half. Judging from the current situation, there were no traces of flesh and bones for the time being. Seeing this, Road laughed self-deprecatingly. "Haha, maybe I'm really scared." Road laughed self-deprecatingly, then turned his head and looked at the chaotic situation in the academy behind him. He couldn't help but curl his lips. What a clumsy scene. So many people were still fooled. Even if they completed the mission, they would lose a lot of face. And my luck is not bad. I can even see the stars breaking through the sky. Road shook his head, withdrew his gaze, and began to think about the issue of retreat. But the next moment, his body suddenly stiffened, and he quickly withdrew his gaze. He stared blankly at the fireball meteor in the sky, and his pupils suddenly shrank sharply. What the hell? It seems to be coming this way. Chapter 851. The warehouse, which was now the ruins, was located in the northwest corner of the academy. To the north was the drainage ditch that ran through the town. Sylvia was kneeling on one knee on the bank, her body like a weathered sculpture, motionless as she stared at the other side, faintly anticipating and even praying that a wretched figure would suddenly jump out from under the ruins and give everyone a big fright. To the west was an open space about 10 feet wide. There was originally a wall of the academy, but in the afternoon, it had fallen in the vigorous demolition of the wall, turning into a long pile of broken stones and bricks. It was also because of this that the outline of the civilian district was exposed a little further away. Of course, with all kinds of terrifying do-chi and magic eruptions from the academy, there was no light in the civilian district, nor was there the slightest noise. Even the most courageous residents chose to flee in fear. They were afraid that the seemingly bright but actually terrifying light would fall on their roofs and cause a tragedy. However, among them, on the roofs of a few small buildings, there were more than 10 people scattered. Not only did they not evacuate, but they also looked in the direction of the academy's warehouse from time to time, as if they were plotting something. When the deafening roar came from before, these more than 10 people quickly knelt on one knee and lowered their heads to fiddle with something. Even when the warehouse was blown up into brilliant fireworks by do-chi and magic, they did not have the slightest interest in looking up. When they had completely finished the work at hand, more than 10 black metal pipes lined up in a row, the warehouse had been razed to the ground and the follow-up search was being carried out. It was also at this time. Finally King down to the ground. Boss is really awesome. After a sigh, a fat figure among them looked around and asked casually, "Are you ready?" "No problem." "Then let's do it." The fat figure licked his lips and touched the cold metal pipe in front of him that was raised at a 45-degree angle. He was very excited. "Brothers, the target of our bombing this time is a void-level warrior and a magus. How is it, do you feel strong excitement?" "It's a little. But Harry, are you sure you want to do this? You should know that boss is also there. If we blast him to death, then it won't be a matter of excitement anymore." He waved his hand nonchalantly. "Don't worry. Boss is very cunning. He has already dug a deep hole to bury himself alive. No matter how we blast him, we won't be able to hit him." Pause for a while, smacked his lips and said, "TSK, but the previous bombardment was really ruthless. If we don't hurry up and deal with it, boss might really be buried alive." F***CK. Then why are you still talking nonsense? Hurry up and give the order. Ahem, I haven't figured out what to do yet. With the murderous glances from both sides, the fat figure's voice gradually weakened. In the end, he could only pout and take out a fiery red crystal object from the box beside him and put it on top of the metal tube. Okay, let's start. 3, 2, 1, release. Alas, so uncreative, amidst a faint sigh of regret, the metal pipes that were lined up in a row suddenly roared in unison. In an instant, sparks shot out, and the cool air in the surroundings seemed to be scorching hot. In an instant, the dark night sky was split by more than 10 fireballs. Like meteors, the flying flames drew a beautiful parabola, and the target was the warehouse ruins in the distance that had just been ravaged. Before the meteors hit, more than 10 people on the small building knelt on one knee, holding the metal tube with one hand and picking up the fiery red crystal with the other. They steadily placed it on the mouth of the tube and let it slide down. A muffled sound rang out again, and more than 10 fireballs shot up into the sky. It was extremely simple, without the slightest superfluous movement. After it was completed smoothly, the cycle repeated again, as if it was endless. They would only stop when all the fiery red crystals in the box beside them were put away. Because of the angle, Sylvia was the first person to notice the strange phenomenon in the sky. She was startled, and her line of sight gradually moved along with the flying meteors until it reached the top of the warehouse ruins. She opened her mouth. What the hell? Rode, who discovered it, said what Sylvia was thinking. Then, he realized that the trajectory of the flying meteors was heading straight for them. The uneasiness in his heart instantly intensified to the extreme, and he yelled, "Watch out above!" In fact, before he yelled, Brock had also discovered the dozen or so small fireballs flying rapidly toward them. At first, he didn't pay much attention to them. After all, he had seen a lot of magic. Besides, although these inconspicuous small fireballs were fast enough, they didn't seem to be any different from the fireballs cast by magic apprentices. But then, he sensed the overwhelming dangerous aura and his expression changed drastically. Above? What's above? Byron and the others subconsciously looked up and stared blankly at the small fireballs that had arrived above their heads. Their thoughts were similar to Brock's. They wondered which ignorant apprentice dared to show off in front of an expert. Didn't he know that even a great mage could only stand aside here? Due to his insane state, Cecily was the last to notice the small fireballs above his head. He was stunned and his eyes widened. As expected of a powerful mage, he instantly sensed that something was wrong and instinctively waved his hand to put up a magic shield. Dodge! With a hoarse howl, the small fireballs swooped down rapidly. Boom! 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 It was as if thunder had exploded directly in the world. In an instant, the earth shook and rocks flew everywhere. Byron and the other bishops and the few ordinary knights were the first victims. In fact, with Byron and the others' strength as great mages, they could have held on for a while if they had put up a magic shield in time. But their shallow combat experience harmed them. As soon as the explosion sounded, their minds went blank, and their bodies were involuntarily lifted off the ground. Then, their bodies rolled in the billowing airwaves like leaves drifting helplessly in the wind. In just a short moment, they were ruthlessly torn apart, and a bloody mist appeared and disappeared without a trace. Roar! At this moment, a heaven-shaking roar suddenly came from the violent explosion. Immediately after, a holy and dazzling holy battle light violently erupted, even pushing back the surrounding billowing air wave. It was Brock. At this time, his clothes were all torn, his beard and hair were all burnt, and he was in a sorry state. However, this also showed that under his seemingly old face, his robust body was covered with old and new scars. He was not worse than a young man. As a genuine void warrior who was born invincible, although Brock did not have a magic shield as strong as a mage, he had a combat energy armor that seemed to have materialized, and a body that was as strong as armor. This was the pride of a warrior that mages could not compare to. In the chaotic environment, he suddenly turned his head and stretched out his big hand. With a bang, he blocked a light figure that flashed past him. This was Cecily. Although he was terrified under the magic shield, he was not injured at all, and his robe was still there. However, he did not have the tyrannical strength of Brock, so under the omnipresent airwaves, he was a little unable to control his body. Fortunately, he was stopped by Brock in time. Otherwise, if he entered the strangling airwaves above, he would immediately follow in the footsteps of Byron and the others. What the hell is this? Cecily had lived for hundreds of years, and the magic books he had read could be piled up to bury him, but he still could not think of a small fireball that could have such terrifying power. Who cares what the F***ck it is, rush out. Roaring and stepping forward, Brock was naturally not in the mood to think about the source of this thing. The combat energy armor outside his body was faintly showing signs of dissipation. If he did not hurry up and rush out of the bombing range, he would stay here forever. Cecily finally came back to his senses when he heard this. He waved his one arm and his lips trembled rapidly. It was obvious that he was preparing some kind of defensive magic. At this time, another round of small fireballs smashed down. In the midst of a series of explosions, Brock gritted his teeth and blocked in front. The void-level combat energy in his body erupted wildly without restraint, stirring up the wind and clouds. In an instant, the fatal airwaves that were surging in from the surrounding area were disrupted, and some who took advantage of the gaps to forcefully block with their majestic bodies. In a short moment, as a mouthful of blood mist was spat out, the materialized combat energy armor shattered with a bang. Then, some pieces of earth and broken tiles that would not attract attention usually became deadly weapons mixed in the strong airwaves, constantly cutting Brock's majestic body, dripping with blood. After all, Brock was old. Although he now had more combat experience and was more experienced in the use of combat energy, his body had inevitably aged greatly, and he was no longer able to resist these terrifying external attacks. But even so, he still dragged Cecilie's magic shield and stepped forward steadily step by step. It was not that he did not want to run at full speed, but the result would only be like flying in the air. In an instant, he would be torn apart by the airwaves rolling around like clouds. At this moment, Cecilie finally finished chanting the spell and raised his arms high. Pieces of prismatic white light cubes appeared out of thin air and assembled. In an instant, an arched light shield like a rock barrier was formed around the two of them, blocking the airwaves and shockwaves coming from all directions. The pressure was suddenly greatly reduced. However, Cecilie, who had just finished casting the spell, suddenly spat out a large mouthful of blood. His old face was distorted as he shouted in horror, "Puff, go quickly!" There was no way he could not panic, because this was almost his last resort. The power of those small fireballs was too fierce. Wave after wave, they did not give them any room to breathe at all. And what was worse was that the continuous explosions not only brought about visible and powerful damage, but also disrupted the invisible magic elements around them. In such a chaotic environment, only a mage like Cecilie could barely mobilize the magic elements. If it were an ordinary mage, they would have been helpless and waiting for death long ago. And even for someone as strong as Cecilie, it was only limited to this one spell. Seeing this, Brock did not dare to be negligent. He held Cecilie, who did not dare to move at all, and ran wildly with his legs and feet. At this moment, Brock's speed far exceeded the limit he could usually reach. Unfortunately, this was still not enough. The defensive ability of the barrier light shield was definitely strong, but the large area of light on the periphery was an obvious target in this turbid environment. So, just when Brock and Cecilie saw the edge of the ruins, several small fireballs suddenly landed accurately in the surrounding area. One of them even smashed directly on the barrier with a boom. Cecilie's face turned pale instantly. Amidst his desperate howls, the barrier light shield shattered easily like crystal glass. Brock's trembling legs took another step forward and smashed heavily on the ground. His legs bent as if he was about to kneel, but his body was sent flying in an instant. He could only watch as the edge of the ruins, which was close at hand, went further and further away. Almost, just a little bit more. Brock closed his eyes unwillingly, fell heavily to the ground, and roared at the sky. This time, there was no heroic anger in his voice. It was like the last roar of a dying magical beast, despairing and sorrowful. Without Brock's support, Cecilie's light figure was instantly thrown into the billowing airwaves behind him. His eyes were lifeless as he looked at the edge of the ruins that was getting further and further away. He suddenly felt very absent-minded. Then, when Twain was being bombed here, he should have been like this as well. Boom, boom, boom. The small fireballs continued to fall from the sky, creating billowing airwaves that soared into the sky, raising dust and stones that covered the sky and earth. They rapidly and continuously shook the area, drowning everything. It was complicated to say, but in fact, this bombing only lasted for about 3 minutes. On the other side, Sylvia also stared blankly for 3 minutes. She watched as this originally huge warehouse turned into a thin layer of ruins, and then turned into a rotten ground full of holes. She also watched as Tang En disappeared in the bombing, followed by Byron, Brock, and Cecily. Taking a deep breath, Sylvia slowly got up and turned to look at the dark civilian area in the west. After observing for so long, she naturally knew that those terrifying fireballs came from there. However, was this Tang En's backup plan? Or was it another force that wanted to take advantage of the situation? After thinking about it, Sylvia gently shook her head, then rushed forward a few steps and leaped over the ditch. She decided to go to the warehouse ruins first. If this was Tang En's backup plan, it meant that Tang En was not dead yet. And even if this was the work of some unknown force, those fireballs were unlikely to hurt her if she was prepared. In short, she had to go over and confirm whether someone was dead or not. Xia Weian's feet involuntarily paused when she landed on the ground. After all, she was unable to see clearly from the other side of the river. Only when she personally came here and saw the countless scorched earth pits of various sizes, which were filled with devastation, could she truly feel the terrifying might of those strange fireballs. If it were any other time, Sylvia would probably think about what kind of magic this was, or what kind of weapon it was. Then she would think about going to the civilian area to investigate. But now, under the influence of an inexplicable feeling, she just looked around casually and then searched everywhere for any possible traces of someone's existence. To be honest, this search was destined to be in vain. Because as far as the eye could see, there were only pits and pits, and even the ruins and garbage were rare. Of course, there was an exception. Outside the original warehouse ruins, Sylvia found a living person, a dying living person. This was Rode, who was paralyzed on a stretcher because of his physical condition. He did not enter the warehouse ruins before, so he was not fatally hit by the fireballs. Of course, because he was too close, he was more or less affected. Now, he was lying on the ground, muttering in a low voice. "I told you! Don't take the initiative to approach him. Don't take the initiative to approach him. Damn it! A group of pig teammates. I can't lead them. I can't lead them." His voice was getting weaker and weaker, and finally, only vague noises could be heard. Without needing to lean over to check, Sylvia knew that he could not be saved, because his blood was about to run out. Shaking her head, Sylvia was about to lean over and put him on the stretcher not far away, but at this moment, suddenly, there was a loud bang. Bang! There was a loud noise behind her, and she suddenly turned her head, only to see a gray figure rushing out of one of the pits. In the air, he could not wait to breathe, as if he was going to suffocate to death in the next moment. Then, without waiting for his body to land, he forcefully turned around and pointed to the west, cursing, "Damn it! What did I tell you before? Moderate bombardment. You might as well kill me too. Ouch, damn it!" Before he finished speaking, he fell back into the pit again, and from the sound, it seemed that the fall was not light. Stunned, Sylvia abandoned Rode and quickly rushed to the side of the pit. Looking down, she saw the gray figure along the edge of the pit, using both hands and feet, struggling to climb up. Then, as if sensing something, he suddenly raised his head and looked at her. After a moment, he grinned, revealing his white teeth. "Ha, it's really fate we meet again so soon. We'll see you later." Thinking of the previous words, Sylvia suddenly felt a little sore in her eyes. Looking up, the night sky was filled with stars, and the cool breeze was slight. Her mood suddenly became very happy. Needless to say, this gray figure was naturally Tang En. As for those so-called fireballs, they were the work of the purple bore cannons. Just as Tang En said before, when he came, he had already expected that this rescue operation would not be simple, so when he set off, he specially brought a batch of purple chamber cannons as a final trump card, just in case. Of course, the purple chamber cannon was very powerful, and if it was not handled properly, it could harm others and himself. So before the rescue plan was launched, Tang En first determined the location of the cannon through the Academy's blueprint, which was the warehouse where there were few people. Then, He took the shovel and sneaked in first to dig a deep pit, thinking that if he succeeded in luring the enemy, he could leave himself a way out if he could not get away. Unexpectedly, Tang En still underestimated the courage of the temple this time. Not only did they send a genuine void-level warrior, they even had a magus partner. This was undoubtedly beyond Tang En's expectations. If there was only one void-level warrior, then Tang En was confident that he could still fight. Even if he could not win, he could use the complicated terrain to hide. First, he could lure the opponent to the ground, and then retreat while fighting. Finally, he could bring the opponent here and solve the problem with the purple chamber cannon. But if there was also a magus, then the situation would be complicated. First of all, there was no need to think about fighting. With the two of them working together, Tang En would definitely die. Moreover, even if he succeeded in luring the opponent here, it would be useless, because the purple chamber cannon could only destroy the opponent when it bombarded a fixed target on the ground. But under the absolute gap in strength, the opponent did not need to pay attention to Tang En's various means at all. It would be fine to directly blast him to death in the air. It was precisely because of this that Tang En had no choice but to risk his life and play a thrilling and intense aerial battle. He narrowly escaped death and cut off Cecily's palm. Then, in front of Cecily, he directly chopped the severed palm into shreds of flesh and bone, finally completely angering the other party. There was no need to talk about what happened after that. Tang En hid in the warehouse and took the initiative to expose himself, causing the other party to bombard him incessantly. At this time, he had already jumped into the deep pit dug in advance and was buried alive. At this point, Tang En had basically done everything he could. Since ancient times, man has proposed and God disposes. If the other party still did not want to come down to see his miserable state to vent their anger, then Tang En could not do anything. Of course, he did not lose anything. Anyway, he had already saved the person. At most, he would be a little unhappy that he had cheated too few people. Fortunately, Tang En's luck was good. Cecily and the others could not hold back the extreme resentment in their hearts. They all descended to look for his non-existent remains, intending to derive pleasure from it. The result was a direct tragedy, but it gave Tang En pleasure. Sometimes, life was just so unpredictable. Chapter 852. Beside the Scorched Earth Pit. This works. After listening to Tang En's brief plan, Sylvia stared blankly at the inconspicuous hole at the bottom of the pit. She could not accept it for a while. The powerful bombardment of Brock and the others, coupled with the terrifying power of the strange fireball, was enough to raise a military checkpoint. But now, it had been easily avoided by a deep pit that looked more like the dwelling place of an underground creature. It was as if the angry breath of a dragon could destroy the world, but in the end, the ant survived unscathed and waved its limbs proudly. Ha ha, why else would I say that you women have long hair and short knowledge? Looking up and laughing, Tang En flipped the hair on his forehead coquettishly. Common sense, do you understand? Have you heard of a bomb shelter? I don't think so. Sigh, I don't even want to talk about you. Sylvia curled her lips but did not get angry. It had to be said that a person's ability to accept things would always become stronger with continuous blows. Compared to having big breasts and no brains, having long hair and short knowledge was really nothing. However, seeing that Sylvia did not respond, Tang En, who was lying on the edge of the pit, became anxious. He looked up and said, "Hey, we've talked for so long. You should at least help me up first." Sylvia was stunned when she heard this. She stretched out her long spear and looked at Tang En up and down. "You're injured?" "Nonsense." Tang En grinned in annoyance. "Try being buried alive. I guarantee that you won't have a complete bone in your body." That was the truth. Tang En had miscalculated before. Although the hole was dug deep enough, it was not an air raid shelter after all, and it was not that sturdy. Therefore, under the previous 2 rounds of bombardment, Tang En was subjected to a terrifying pressure in the hole. The surrounding space was quickly filled with soil, which then began to crush every bone in his body. If not for the fact that the purple bore cannon's firing frequency was too fast, which solved the problem in a short 3 minutes, Tang En might really have been buried alive. Ha ha! After learning about Tang En's current situation, Sylvia suddenly chuckled and simply withdrew her long spear. So, you're really a little pitiful. But why should I help you? Huh! Tang En was dumbfounded. Are you kidding me? I just saved you. You can't be so immoral. Don't forget you were the one who brought me into the warehouse. Unfortunately, this doesn't count. Although it was difficult for Sylvia to kill Tang En now because of their constant entanglement, it did not mean that she had forgotten what had happened before, especially the scene in the northern wilderness. Therefore, she naturally wouldn't let go of the rare opportunity to see Tang En make a fool of himself. F***ck. Tang En knew that he had been careless. He shouldn't have let this woman know about his current embarrassing situation. After thinking about it, he decided to change his strategy and said bitterly, "All right, even if that doesn't count. But you are the famous flower of nights. Is there no such thing as taking pleasure in helping others in the temple?" Of course there are, but the target of salvation definitely doesn't include an evil heretic like you. Moreover, I am now a traitor of the temple. F***ck. Swearing is not a good habit. It will also make me even less willing to save you. Tang En was speechless. He stared at Xiao Weian, who had a relaxed expression and was clearly trying to tease him. After a moment, he let out a long sigh and said, "Right now, I seriously doubt whether you are still the Xiao Weian I know." "Of course I am, but a shrewd hunter will always learn some cunning from a fox, won't he?" Looking at the frustrated Tang En, Sylvia was in a particularly good mood. Then she thought of something and raised her eyebrows. "It's not impossible for me to pull you up. Well, I seem to remember that I still owe you a favor. Don't even think about it." Twain rejected the proposal without even thinking about it. He was used to taking advantage of others, so how could he so easily give away the advantage in his hands? He turned his hand and showed the dagger, plunged it into the scorched earth, summoned the strength that he had accumulated in this moment, and climbed up with a grimace. This time it was Sylvia's turn to be stunned. Looking at Tang En, who seemed to be willing to sacrifice his life rather than his wealth, she could not help but be speechless. Finally, she shook her head and helped Tang En up. "Huff. This is your own initiative. It's not a favor." As soon as Tang En came up, Xiao Weian rolled her eyes, and Tang En took the initiative to conclude the matter. Then, he thought of something and took half a step back vigilantly. "Hey, the sneak attack from before doesn't count. Speaking of which, you have already taken advantage of me. Not only did you cancel out a favor, but you also took away my first kiss." Pause for a while. "Of course, if it's just a friendly kiss, well, although it's a bit of a loss, we're acquaintances. I'll reluctantly agree to it. Of course, it was just a joke." Tang En, who had turned the tables in one fell swoop, was in a good mood now. His performance was just habitually flirtatious. However, for Sylvia, this was still a bit too much. Sylvia's eyes twitched when she heard this. Previously, she thought that she had already understood the shamelessness of this guy in front of her. She did not think that it was far from enough. She took a deep breath and suppressed the urge to smash this annoying face in front of her with a gun. She thought to herself, "If I'm serious with this wretched guy, I'll lose. If I'm serious, I'll lose." She suddenly smiled and said, "You want to kiss me? I've said it before. I only like men who are stronger than me." Tang En bent his arm and posed in a bodybuilding posture. "It may be a bit hurtful to say it, but the fact is, I'm stronger than you." "Is that so?" Sylvia also stretched out her palm. "How about we compete in pure physical strength? How about arm wrestling?" Tang En's expression suddenly froze. Thinking of the horrible scene where Sylvia sent him high into the sky with a single gun, he could not help but cough twice. Ahem. Hey, the moonlight tonight is so beautiful. Rolling her eyes again, Sylvia turned around and walked a few steps. Suddenly, she said, Rhodes and the others are dead. This time, the temple's plan against you has failed, but, she paused and said in an inexplicable tone, if you still intend to fight the temple to the death, next time you may not be so lucky. There was no need to say it explicitly, but it was certain that the next time they met, it would be difficult to talk about cooperation. They would probably fight directly. Tang En naturally understood what she meant. The smile on his face gradually disappeared. After a moment of silence, he shook his head slightly. Then we'll talk about it when the time comes. Well, compared to me, you should be more worried about yourself. Again, I'm not optimistic about your return to the temple this time, and I'm not optimistic about the Puritans. If one day you become the target of the temple again and have nowhere to go, maybe I can help you. Tang En was not a fool. Because of his preconceived ideas, he had never regarded Sylvia as a woman, so he would not have any abnormal thoughts. But after the kiss in the warehouse, he vaguely understood something. No matter how many chances and coincidences were behind that kiss, it could not cover up a fact. That was, if Sylvia still hated him as much as before and wanted to kill him as soon as possible, it was absolutely impossible for her to do such a thing. She doesn't seem to hate me now, and she may even have some vague feelings for me. This was not narcissistic boasting. Although realizing this, Tang En was a little happy in his heart. It was more indescribable, complicated thoughts. If they still hated each other as before, Tang En would not have any psychological burden, and he would kill her if he had the chance. But now, the situation was different, and because of this, it was necessary to bring up the past. To put it crudely, whether she admitted it or not, whether she was forced or not, Tang En did leave a mark on Sylvia's body, and that layer of membrane was indeed pierced by him. This was a fact that could not be changed. From a biological point of view, she was his woman, even if it was only once, even if it was only for a short time. The night was quiet, and there was a long silence. Sylvia did not agree or refute. She just waved her hand and strode away. Her faint voice drifted with the wind. Then, we'll talk about it when the time comes. More than 10 feet to the west, watching this scene. It's over, it's over, it's over. Holding his head, Harry's expression was very conflicted. Boss, what do you want me to say to you? Josiah, Lena, and now Sylvia popping out. You're really cool, really awesome. But why do I have to bump into them all? This is making it very difficult for me, bastard. Some were happy, some were sad. Harry was very distressed, but there were people who were extremely happy. For example, the parents of the students, and for example, the police chief who was as fat as a pig. After confirming that more than 1,000 students were safe and sound, this absolute disaster became a good thing that could be greatly rewarded. Of course, this was all for later, and there was no need to talk about it. The good thing that could be confirmed at the moment was that with the collective death of Rhodes and the others, the chaos in the academy had finally come to an end. This night, finally, gradually returned to its original tranquility. Chapter 853. Ding. Long-term quest. Light dusk. Stage reward. 200 EXP gained. Ding. 200 EXP gained. Ding. 150 EXP gained. Block. In the system space, Tang En waved his hand as if he was shooing away flies, and directly snuffed out the system's synthetic voice. It had to be said that the system was indeed formal and strict, so strict that it made people speechless. Killing any small fry, even if the reward was only 10 or 20 EXP, but as long as Tang En stepped into the system space, the system's synthetic voice would not tire of reminding him. Although the rewards were always exciting, as time passed, anyone would get tired of it. The reason why Tang En was in a good mood now, and he would not fight unless it was absolutely necessary, and he would not use his sword unless he was an expert, was almost all thanks to the system. He casually greeted and walked over. "Hey, old butler, how was my performance this time?" The old butler was not reading this time, but his posture of reclining on the rattan chair with his eyes closed was obviously a silent rejection of any disturbances. However, Tang En naturally did not care about this. In his mind, although the old butler was not an intelligent NPC, he definitely had the abilities of an intelligent NPC, such as not needing to rest. The old butler did not know whether Tang En's thoughts were clear or not, but he really did not care. Perhaps he knew the other party's lazy personality, so he was too lazy to say anything. Without opening his eyes, he nodded. "Not bad, if not for the fact that I almost buried myself alive in the end." He touched his nose. Don't worry about these details. Even a wise man can make mistakes. Have you heard of that?" "I have. But you're an assassin, not a wise man. If an assassin makes a mistake, it basically means death." "Tisk, that makes sense." Tang En did not refute, because that was the truth. Then he shrugged and sighed. "Old butler, I'm not weak now, right? But that stupid temple just threw out 2 experts and beat me to a pulp. I could only think of other unorthodox ways to deal with them. That really hurts my pride." The old butler opened his eyes and said calmly, "First of all, the temple has a history of 1,000 years, so it's normal for them to have such a foundation. Secondly, the 2 experts you said they threw out casually, each of them had at least 100 years of cultivation. You, on the other hand, have only cultivated for slightly more than 2 years, and you even managed to kill him in the end." I seem to be a little greedy." Upon hearing the old butler's words, Tang En touched his chin and also felt that he was a little unreasonable and arrogant. Not just a little, but a lot. The old butler did not seem to intend to let go of the opportunity to beat Tang En. He continued, "With your current strength, there's no need for you to belittle yourself. The experts of the other world are not as unattainable as you think. You're now 1 step into the peak of the other world." Do you have any?" Tang En was shocked when he heard this. "No way, my current strength is at most void level." "Is the void level very low?" The old butler countered with a question before shaking his head. "Let's take martial artists as an example. Martial artists from other worlds cultivate battle chi. Before the earth level, one would cultivate one's body. After the earth level, one's strength would be determined by the amount of do chi elements one could control between heaven and earth. Martial artists at this level basically don't temper their bodies anymore, and this is a dead end that gets narrower and narrower." As if afraid that Tang En did not understand, the old butler waved his hand, and a pile of sand, a teacup, and a wooden bucket appeared in front of him. This teacup is a martial artist who has just entered the martial Tao. At this time, his capacity is very small, and the sand he can hold is only this much battle chi. When he reaches earth level, his capacity will increase and he will become a wooden bucket. With another wave of his hand, a small half of the sand flew into the wooden bucket until it was full. Look, this is the limit that this earth-level martial artist can bear. Perhaps he has reached void-level cultivation at this time, but his body can only hold so much battle chi. After that, he will have a difficult time on the road of martial arts until he can't move an inch. According to what you said. Tang En opened his mouth and pointed to the wooden bucket. Then aren't all the other martial artists in the other world in this wooden bucket? Do they only have this high strength? Just to give an example, everyone's talent is different. For example, Sylvia, her talent is extraordinary. After reaching earth level, she is no longer a wooden bucket, but a wooden basin. Naturally, she can hold more sand. But whether it is a wooden bucket or a wooden basin, they have their limit. I understand the body is the king. No wonder you have been making me train hard in all aspects of basic fitness. Tang En nodded to show that he understood, then looked at the wooden bucket and smacked his lip. Then wouldn't the battle chi martial artists in the other world have no future? Not all, there are always a few exceptions. The old butler shook his head. For example, Bamitu you met in the Royal Library Pavilion in the Northern Wilderness. He is smarter and absorbed a lot of magical beast souls, which is equivalent to creating many wooden buckets out of thin air. This is the reason why you don't put all your eggs in the same basket. There is also that brand sword god Wu Ding. Although you haven't met him, when Bamita first saw you, he misunderstood that your battle chi was highly condensed and that you were like Wu Ding's disciple. Looking at it, that Wu Ding's path should be to highly purify and condense his battle chi. Speaking of this, the old butler pressed his palm down, and the sand in the wooden bucket quickly compressed and shrank. In an instant, half of the bucket sank. In this way, although the external limit is still there, the capacity has increased, and more sand can be put in. They are all King geniuses. Looking at this miraculous scene, Tang En couldn't help but sigh with admiration. Hearing this, the old butler didn't object. He only said, "There are 306 paths in martial arts, and all of them lead to the peak. However, once some paths go astray, it will be very bumpy. If you want to reach the end, you will have to put in 100 or 1,000 times more effort." Moreover, those who have this idea are all heaven-sent geniuses with great wisdom and stupidity, which is very rare. Most people can only be stuck halfway and be afraid of the slightest thing. This is why I said that you have already stepped into the ranks of the top warriors in the other world. Your strength is secondary. The main reason is that they are all in the same place and can't move forward. It is inevitable that they will be surpassed. That makes sense, that makes sense. After hearing this, Tang En stood up. He felt that every step he took forward would surpass countless experts. He was immediately motivated and couldn't wait to say, "Then what are we waiting for? Old butler, open the cultivation room." Which one? The space cultivation room? The system categorized various aspects of cultivation into different cultivation areas. Recently, Tang En had been pondering the profound meaning of space. This was also the reason why he could successfully cut off Cecily's palm with one slash. That was why the old butler asked this question. However, this time, Tang En obviously had a different idea. He rolled his eyes and said, "No, this time, I will only cultivate my physical strength." At the end, he added, as if explaining, "Just like you said, the body is the biggest capital to improve strength." Okay. The old butler waved his hand, and a compartment appeared out of thin air. It was the strength cultivation room. Then, he closed his eyes and lay back on the rattan chair again. He said leisurely, "Let me give you a friendly reminder. Sylvia has innate divine strength. You won't be able to win against her in an arm wrestle in the short term. *CK, what I'm afraid of comes." Hearing that his hidden intentions were ruthlessly exposed, Tang En's body suddenly stiffened. However, he reacted quickly. He waved his hand and jumped into the compartment. "I don't understand what you are talking about. *CK, the older you get, the weirder you are. You can't hide anything from me." As soon as he stepped into the strength cultivation room, Tang En, whose face was full of resentment, suddenly felt his body sink. It was like the hug of goddess Gaia from before. However, this time, it was purely caused by the influence of gravity. It was also an excellent way to improve strength. Instead of immediately starting to cultivate, Tang En first pulled out the killer panel to see how much experience and blood vitality had increased. After a short chat with the old butler, the block data finally stopped jumping. However, it did not bring any surprises to Tang En. His experience and blood vitality did not increase. The only surprise was that there was an additional medal, Swindler, which should be the reason why his scheme succeeded this time. including the Blasphemer and Thousand Slayer. He already had 3 medals. The effect of these medals was very weak and basically useless. However, thinking of what the old butler said before, as long as he collected more medals, he could exchange them for things from the system. It was better than nothing. Dispersing the killer panel, Tang En moved his body and entered the training state. He gritted his teeth and said, "Little guy, how dare you look down on me? If I don't suppress you, I won't be able to maintain my position as the husband." Chapter 854. The battle at ancient Wheat City Academy had finally come to an end. Although those who knew about it kept the identities of the main combatants a secret, the aftermath would naturally not end so easily. However, this had little to do with Tang En. Although he was also one of the main parties involved, he brought the gray space back to Cold Water City early after the battle to recuperate. He also entered the system space to strengthen his training in an attempt to restore his authority. Other matters such as transferring the secret organization, choosing the location of the assassin organization, and so on were all left to David and the others. As for the matter with the Northern Temple, although it was Tang En who started it, it had always been his style to kill without caring about the consequences. Moreover, this matter had long been out of his control, and he was no longer the one who was leading the charge now. Compared to Twain's leisure, the people of the Northern Temple were much more miserable, especially Archbishop Varen, who had just arrived. After receiving the news that Rhodes' team was almost completely wiped out, he did not react for a long time. As soon as he came back to his senses, he smashed everything in his hands with an ashen face, and his angry roar almost spread throughout Holy Light City. It should be said that Archbishop Varen's ability was not bad. First of all, he had good foresight and knew how to hit the snake where it hurt. As soon as he arrived, the first order he gave was to send out an elite team to encircle and suppress Tang En, the source of the disaster. It would be best if they could take back the Eye of Disaster in one piece. Secondly, there was no problem with his judgment. Varen admitted that he did not underestimate Tang En. Not only did he choose the Crazy Road as the leader, but he also hoped to achieve the effect of fighting poison with poison. He also sent out the most elite team on hand, as well as the 2 powerhouses, Brock and Sassily, who were specially invited from the headquarters. It was reasonable to say that with such a luxurious and amazing lineup, it would be fine if Tang En did not appear. Once he appeared, there would be no problem in taking him down. However, reality slapped Varen in the face very straightforwardly. Except for some ordinary knights who had fled after seeing the general situation, Brock, Sassily, Rhodes, and all the other powerhouses who were ranked in the team returned to the embrace of the God of Light one after another. Damn it. Just when Varen was both angry and worried that his mission might turn into a mess, the disappeared Puritans returned with Sylvia. Well, that was not the point. Although Varen was a little embarrassed when the other party questioned the whereabouts of Byron and the others. But at his position, it was easy for him to shirk responsibility because there were plenty of people willing to take the blame for him. More importantly, Xia Weian had also brought back a half-dead bishop, the same bishop who had fallen from a high altitude with Tang En and experienced the Fast and Furious experience. He didn't die, but his legs were broken. Naturally, he fell into Sylvia's hands. Not only did Sylvia regain her innocence, but it also brought a lot of trouble to Varen. Although the bishop was not Byron, he was aware of Varen's previous intention to show favoritism. Thus, several letters of evidence against Varen's favoritism were quickly sent to the headquarters. Well, everything was not going well. But at this time, Varen was no longer in the mood to pay attention to these things, because the death information of a large number of clergymen who had disappeared without a trace was surging in from all directions, instantly drowning his luxurious office desk. In fact, situations like this had always been happening. Varen knew about it when he first arrived at the headquarters of the Northern Temple. He also knew that the original Bounty Hunter Guild had become a mission platform for the assassination of clergymen. But because the riots of the believers were getting more and more intense, and were gradually showing signs of getting out of control, Varen did not pay much attention to it. But this time, the momentum was really too great. Farms, towns, cities, priests, deacons, knights, the shadow of death seemed to have instantly spread across all the churches in the north, regardless of their size. Then, it loomed over the heads of every clergyman, regardless of their position. In just a few days, as the death information continued to accumulate, not only did it not show any signs of stopping, but it also seemed to be getting crazier and crazier. Varen was completely petrified. Then came anger. Towering anger. He shouted that the dignity of the temple was not to be blasphemed, and wantonly sent out countless people to launch a crazy counterattack. The power of the temple was still huge. Although it was in a predicament of internal and external troubles, once this huge machine was operating at full capacity, the results would soon emerge. It was similar to the news they had received before, but this time, the identities of the murderers were more complicated. In addition to bounty hunters, there were assassins, mercenaries, thieves. Except for mages, almost all the professions of combat aura warriors were listed. It was really shocking. Varen was at a loss. If the other party was a force, they could just send people to kill them directly. But the reality was that these murderers were not related at all. It was as if all the warriors in the north had become the enemies of the temple overnight. How were they supposed to kill them? After some investigation, it turned out that it was the work of some assassin organization. The assassination reward was also the secret manual that could rapidly increase a warrior's combat aura strength. At first, Varen thought it was ridiculous. He had lived for hundreds of years and had never heard of such a heaven-defying thing, but now he was a little surprised and doubtful. The reason was simple. It was impossible that all the warriors were fools, right? The efficiency of the temple was really good. Soon, a piece of related information entered their field of vision. The Shanghai City Auction House had once auctioned a mysterious combat aura cultivation method secret manual. This secret manual was very old, estimated to have a history of thousands of years, and the language inside was obscure and difficult to understand. But what was shocking was that this secret manual was auctioned for a sky-high price of 5 million gold coins, and the buyer was found dead in the wilderness not long after. It was naturally difficult to accurately estimate the value of an ancient item, but since it could be auctioned for a sky-high price of 5 million gold coins, it was definitely not simple. Could it be this was the heaven-defying secret manual that could rapidly increase one's combat aura strength? The buyer was killed by Tang En? So now the item had fallen into his hands? It was a very simple and logical conjecture, but it also made Varen even more surprised. Could there really be such a heaven-defying thing in this world? In fact, having this thought meant that he believed most of it. Varen was completely flustered. He naturally knew that if this secret manual really had such an effect, then it would be a fatal attraction to combat aura warriors. Not to mention the Temple of Light, even if the God of Light personally came down to stop them, he would probably be directly overturned by the warriors who had lost their minds. It was all because of Tang En. Everything was because of that damn Tang En. Varen came to his senses and wished that he could immediately see Tang En's corpse in front of him. In fact, that was exactly what he planned to do. But at this time, Tang En had once again disappeared from everyone's sight. And this time, it was even more extreme. Not only him, but the intelligence agency of the Grey Coat Army had also disappeared. It seemed that other than the mysterious assassin organization and the Grey Coat Army in the depths of the 100,000 mountains, all the information and personnel related to him had disappeared without a trace. What was left were the believers who vented their dissatisfaction and agitation to the temple. There were also the combat aura warriors who rushed forward one after another to break through the enemy lines. For the temple, the believers could not be touched, and the warriors could not be killed off. The Grey Coat army was also out of the question. In the end, Varen could only set his sights on the mysterious assassin organization, hoping to repeat Rhodes' strategy and force Tang En out again. But the results of his investigation once again left him speechless. This assassin organization did not have a fixed location. Taverns, hotels, ordinary houses. Any place could become a platform for the assassin organization to issue missions. Moreover, it was a freaking weird style of changing locations after every shot. The temple's influence was huge, but it was absolutely impossible for it to be so meticulous. And even if it had the ability, the time it would take was also a big problem. Yes, time was the fatal weakness of Varen and the temple. The believers were rioting, the clergy were dying one after another, and the foundation of the temple was on the verge of collapse. They could no longer wait. 1 day, 2 days, 3 days. 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks. As time passed, Varen was completely at a loss as he looked at the situation that did not improve at all but worsened instead. What was even more frightening was that at this time, he could not help but have a thought: if this went on, the temple would really be driven out of the north. P.S. The pace has sped up. It's almost time to fill in the holes in this book. Well, the average number of subscriptions is now 481. I still hope that readers can help the Civet Cat break through the 500 subscriptions level. Here, thank you in advance. Nonsense doesn't count. Chapter 855. The past few years had been eventful for the Bran. To be more precise, no matter if one wanted to admit it or not, ever since someone came to this world, it was like a demon king had suddenly descended. Then, the Bran began to feel unsettled. Of course, it was important to note that these unsettled situations were only in the north of Bran. For example, the attack of the northern wilderness, the rise of the Grey Coat army, the turmoil of the temple, and so on. These major events were enough to be recorded in the history book. They stirred up the present, the past, and the future in the north of Bran. However, this was basically limited to the north. Because of the geographical differences, although the south and the north were both in the Bran, there seemed to be a natural moat between them. The south looked down on the chaos and poverty of the north, and the north looked down on the pettiness of the south. In the eyes of the southern residents, the barbarians in the northern wilderness, bandits everywhere, the situation at the front line, and so on, other than slightly satisfying their curiosity through the newspapers, they did not care about anything else. Of course, now that the Temple of Light was in a predicament in the north, the southern residents naturally did not know much about it. Of course, this was also because the Temple of Light forcefully blocked the news. But even if the southern residents knew, they would not be too shocked. After all, these were too far away from their lives, and if there was a place that felt the furthest away, it was undoubtedly the prosperous and peaceful capital of Bran all year round. In the morning, in the capital of Bran, more than 10 miles away from the outskirts of the eastern part of the city, there were rolling hills, lush forests, and large tracts of extremely eye-catching green vegetation. Occasionally, there were lakes that looked like silver plates with full moons in them. At first glance, it would make people feel relaxed and happy. However, this beautiful environment was not something that everyone could appreciate, because this was the hunting ground of the Bran Palace. Of course, it was not all. Slightly to the south, there was an ordinary terrain area separated by a silver belt mountain spring. That was a private territory. Even the royal family members were not allowed to enter, because that was the place where the Pillar of the Bran, the world's strongest man, the god of swords, Wu Ding, lived. As for why the sword god didn't live in a luxurious palace in the city, and instead chose to live in such a remote place, perhaps it's because Teacher doesn't like the impetuous atmosphere there, as well as being disturbed by those big shots who are full of scheming thoughts. A middle-aged man with a slightly weathered face thought as he looked into the distance. A moment later, He looked down at the uneven and rugged path beneath his feet and shook his head slightly. It was just that this road was too ugly and difficult to walk. As far as the eye could see, the royal hunting ground's vast grassland could be seen. It would undoubtedly be much easier to travel from there, whether by foot or by car. However, the middle-aged man did not take that path, and no one would take that path. They wanted to go to the residence of the sword god. Therefore, they had to take this narrow path that led out of the city gate. It was either a rugged mountain path or a stone staircase. He didn't know if it was intentional or not, but it was impossible to drive on this small road. Therefore, if one didn't have a good physique, it wouldn't be easy to walk all the way to the door of the sword god's residence. At the very least, it wasn't something that those big-bellied politicians or magicians with weak physiques could do. As for flying directly in the air, even warriors and magicians who had the ability to do so wouldn't choose to do so, because it was disrespectful to the sword god. Although the sword god might not have any opinions about such behavior, there would always be someone who would teach the other party a lesson on his behalf, so that the other party would know how to write the two words rules. Walking back and forth, under the familiar pace of this weathered middle-aged man, he quickly reached the end of the rugged mountain path. At this moment, a mottled stone stood upright on the side of the road, with the words Wu Ding's small residence written on it. The middle-aged man raised his eyebrows and looked at the crooked handwriting that was like that of a beginner's. He couldn't help but sigh in his heart. Sure enough, after looking at it for a few decades, I still find it an eyesore. This was undoubtedly the handwriting of the sword god Wu Ding, and anyone who came here would see it. However, other than a few people who didn't think much of it, the other people who didn't know what was going on would come here and look at the handwriting left and right. In the end, most of them would sigh with emotion. As expected of the sword god, even his handwriting is so special that it's difficult for ordinary people to compare. After passing this stone and stepping out of the mountain path, the scene in front of them suddenly opened up. Other than the few ordinary buildings that were surrounded by the bamboo forest in the distance, there was a large open space. On the two sides of the open space near the mountain path, there were many simple tents, simple huts, and other temporary buildings. There were also many people who were sitting cross-legged. There were men, women, old and young. Some had their heads lowered in contemplation, some had their eyes closed in cultivation, and some were making hand gestures to communicate in low voices. It looked a little messy, but almost no sound could be heard, not to mention the noise, as if they were afraid of disturbing something. If one had to say what these people, who seemed to have gathered from all over the world, had in common, perhaps it was that they were all not weak. This could be seen from their appearances. And this was indeed the case. However, when they saw the weathered middle-aged man walk into the open space, everyone around stood up and saluted from a distance. The gazes that were cast over were filled with envy, gratitude, reverence, and so on. This was inevitable because they all knew that this weathered middle-aged man was the first disciple of the sword god Wu Ding, Hai Ta. Slowly walking towards the bamboo forest building, Hai Ta nodded to the left and right in return, showing a generous and gentle smile. Of course, he knew why these people were here, and it was obvious that they were here for a long time. Teacher only accepted 3 disciples in his life, including himself. It seemed that the number was very small, but it wasn't an exaggeration to say that each of them had shocking strength. More importantly, the 3 of them weren't all outstanding talents, nor were they all children of influential families. What did this mean? This meant that everyone had the possibility of becoming the 4th disciple of the sword god teacher. With such a soul-stirring motivation, naturally, everyone rushed like a flock of ducks. And even if they couldn't become teacher's disciple, staying here was extremely beneficial. Because teacher had a gentle temperament, every time he had free time or when he was in the mood, he would often come out of his residence to start a lecture, answering questions without hesitation. As for the guidance of the sword god, It was undoubtedly priceless advice to any martial artist with these thoughts in mind. Hai-Ta came to the bamboo forest building, stepped forward, and pushed open the wooden door of his residence. He turned around and nodded to the people outside who hadn't sat down yet, gently closing the wooden door and cutting off the countless gazes of worship and inquiry. Sigh. Holding the wooden door handle, Hai-Ta suddenly sighed, looking a little bleak. Everyone in the brand worshipped the sword god, worshipping him as a true god. They believed that as long as the sword god was here, the glory of the Bran Empire would last forever. But how could they know that the mountains would be eroded by the wind, and the sword god would also grow old? Thinking of this, Hai-Ta shook his head, looking a little worried. Although as a disciple, it was a little disgraceful to speculate that the sword god would grow old. But because he was a disciple, Hai-Ta knew the sword god's physical condition better than anyone else. Their teacher was indeed old. Their teacher had never been secretive about this in front of his fellow disciples. He would casually mention it, but sometimes, his gaze towards them had a hint of anticipation. Hai-Ta certainly knew what teacher was expecting. There was only one sword god, but there were 3 disciples of the sword god. Oh, now there were 2. And could they be like teacher, indomitable, supporting the glory of the Bran? Hai-Ta didn't have much confidence in this. He was clear about his own ability. His talent was really ordinary. Although he was personally taught by teacher and was the first disciple of teacher, his strength was almost the lowest. Junior brother's current strength was not as high as his, but with his talent, it wouldn't take long for him to surpass him. But junior brother's character, sighing silently, Hai-Ta turned around and stepped forward to look for teacher. Well, at this time, teacher should be napping and fishing in the backyard. Thinking of this, he didn't stop walking, but his expression was still a little absent-minded. If junior brother Zwafan was still alive, then teacher wouldn't have to worry anymore. That must be the case. Junior brother Zwafan was praised by teacher as the person who resembled him the most. However, when teacher took back junior brother Zwafan's golden sword, he was already old. Chapter 856. Senior brother. Just as Hai-Ta was lost in his thoughts, he suddenly shouted in surprise. A handsome young man with sword-like eyebrows and thin lips suddenly jumped out from the side, his expression slightly excited. "Ha, it really is senior brother. You haven't been here for 2 months. How is it? Has anything new happened outside recently?" "Alas, I'm miserable. I'm trapped here all year round and can't go down the mountain. I don't know what teacher is thinking. It's so boring here." Hearing this, Hai-Ta couldn't help but frown and interrupt. "Junior brother, don't you understand teacher's painstaking efforts? Teacher didn't make you stay here to trap you, but to let you." He waved his hand repeatedly. "Senior brother, you're here again. I understand. I'm impetuous. I stay here to cultivate my mind and consolidate my cultivation. How did you become like teacher?" The handsome young man curled his lips and said disapprovingly. "You." Hai-Ta, who was dull and not good with words, opened his mouth but didn't know what to say. In the end, he could only look at Wensilin, who came from a wealthy family and was also teacher's last disciple. He shook his head slightly and changed the topic. "Is teacher in the pond in the back?" "Yes." "Then I'll go first." Hai-Ta nodded slightly and continued to walk to the back. At the same time, he couldn't help but sigh in his heart. Among the 3 brothers, Wensilin's martial talent was the highest, but this junior brother was good in every way, just that his temperament was a bit too impulsive. "Oh," Wensilin responded listlessly. He stood there with a hesitant look on his face. He knew that senior brother Hai-Ta would definitely bring him some fresh news from the outside. But if he went to listen, he might be criticized by teacher and senior brother, so he was very conflicted. In the end, he couldn't resist the curiosity in his heart and chased after him. "Senior brother, wait, I'll go with you," in the back courtyard, there was a clear pond in the bamboo forest. After Haita and Wensilin arrived, they saw a figure sitting on a straw mat under the shadow of green bamboo on the right side of the pond. This was a thin old man, somewhat stooped, wearing green clothes. At a glance, he looked no different from an ordinary old farmer. It was probably because he was old and his physical strength was no longer good at farming, so now he picked up the hobbies that he wanted to do in the past but didn't have the time, such as planting flowers, fishing, and so on. He was fishing now, but perhaps because the breeze in the forest was too comfortable, his pair of old eyes were slightly closed and he was slowly dozing off. It was hard to believe that he could pull the rod back in time when a fish took the bait. But the truth was that if someone were to say that this old man could instantly destroy the Bran Palace that was over 10 li away with just a light flick of the green bamboo fishing rod, no one would doubt it. Because this ordinary-looking and seemingly exhausted old man was the #1 expert of the Caesar continent, Bran godly swordsman Wu Ding. Teacher. Gently walking over, Sea Tower and Winston bowed respectfully outside the banquet. The green-clothed Wu Ding slowly opened his eyes. There was no terrifying light like the unsheathed sword, just a pair of ordinary turbid old eyes. Oh, there was also a trace of a gentle smile. He casually waved his hand and said in a calm tone, "You've come, Haita. Sit down." Yes. Nodding, Haita and Wensilin each took the two sides of the straw mat and sat across from their teacher. Winston was the youngest among them, so he naturally picked up a pot and a teacup and poured tea. Haita looked at the empty straw basket and smiled. "It seems that teacher hasn't caught anything today." "Yes, I've been fishing for so many years. The fish here all recognize me, but they just don't take the bait." Putting down the green bamboo fishing rod, Wu Ding rubbed his hands. His expression was somewhat resentful and helpless, like a naughty child. On the side, Winston's mouth twitched imperceptibly when he heard this. He handed over the teacup, but in his heart, he disapproved. "Teacher, your fishing rod doesn't have any bait or hook, so how can you catch a fish with that? He reminded you and you said you didn't understand. Isn't this completely useless?" Taking a sip of the light green tea, Wu Ding seemed to have thought of something and asked casually, "How is it? Is teaching the prince's homework going smoothly?" The Bran Sword God was the Bran Sword God in the end. Even if he didn't want to have too much contact with the imperial power, his strength, influence, and other factors made it impossible. Of course, with Sword God Wu Ding's status, if he didn't want to, no one would dare to say anything, let alone force him. But it was still the same principle. Since he was already in the mortal world, there were some things that couldn't be forcefully rejected. So Haita, as the #1 disciple of the Sword God, also had another identity, and that was to be the teacher of the Bran princes. It wasn't necessarily to teach martial art. In fact, as the princes of the Bran, it was very likely that they would become the next king of the Bran. Martial arts were not important to them. What was important was this relationship, the relationship between the Sword God and the imperial court. This was what everyone paid attention to. "It's going smoothly." Haita nodded, his expression calm, but his next words were not so calm. The first prince's personality is still heroic and domineering, and his actions are domineering. He has a strong martial heart. The second prince is gentle and humble, and his relationship with me is the closest. I naturally want to rope him in. He spoke in a calm and straightforward manner, and soon, he described the characteristics of the prince's personalities in detail. "Haha, the people of the world say that my first disciple is gentle and kind. Who would have thought that he would talk about others behind their backs? It's truly strange." "Teacher." Haita looked at the playful smile on Wu Ding's face and helplessly shook his head. He knew that his teacher's mischievous personality was acting up again. Just as he had said, perhaps Sword God Wu Ding had no intention of getting involved with imperial power, but how could the imperial court not care about his opinion? Thus, when it came time to choose the next king, whether he was willing or not, Wu Ding had to express his opinion. And the source of these opinions naturally came from Haita. And from this aspect, Haita was actually a shield pushed out by Wu Ding. But when the master had matters to attend to, it was normal for the disciple to take care of the work. Of course, these evaluations of the princes were just routine words. It was impossible to make any decisions. After ignoring his teacher's teasing, Haita frowned and continued, "Teacher, the situation has been a bit turbulent recently." "Tell me about it." Wu Ding's tone was still calm, as if he was talking about what to eat for lunch. In fact, this was more or less the case. In the eyes of this old man who had stood at the peak of the world for more than 100 years, the affairs of the world were like clouds. First is the northern wilderness. News came from the front lines that the tribes in the northern wilderness are frequently mobilizing their forces. It seems that there will be a great battle this winter. "Didn't we beat those barbarians enough last year?" Wenslin raised his eyebrows and said sarcastically. This was almost the general attitude of the Bran people towards the northern wilderness. But unlike Wenslin, Wu Ding touched his forehead and sighed. "It is indeed a big problem." Haita nodded solemnly, obviously agreeing with his teacher's opinion. "Big problem? Barbarians? Why, every few years they would start a great battle, but in the end didn't we drive them back?" Haita shook his head and said, "Junior, this time is different from the past. There is no second Z in the Bran." Wenslin opened his mouth and couldn't help but be silent. No matter how arrogant he was, he didn't dare to criticize the only person in the Bran who was as famous as his teacher, the military god Z. And Z did have such an important position. Since he joined the army, the military situation between the Bran and the northern wilderness was completely reversed. In the following decades, the fierce northern wilderness barbarians never broke through the defense line of the Bran army, not even once. The entire Bran's northern territory and tens of millions of people also had to protect his reputation. They didn't have to fight, and they lived a peaceful life for decades. But now, this peerless prodigy who shocked the continent had left. Although the Bran army was still the powerful Bran army, but among the generals and marshals in the army, who would dare to stand out and inherit Z's glory? And who would dare to guarantee that they would continue to keep the northern wilderness barbarians out of the country? After a moment of silence, Wu Ding raised his head and asked, "What's the decision from the royal court?" "Increase the troops, transfer the Tiger Roar Legion from the south to the front line." "But," after a pause, Haida frowned and shook his head, "there's a problem now. The Zechen Legion hasn't been able to settle down. It's mainly about the choice of the new marshal. There's a lot of disagreement in the parliament." "Ridiculous. What time is it, a bunch of reckless idiots?" The mischievous smile on Wu Ding's face instantly disappeared. Although he wasn't a member of the army, he had lived for so long, so he could naturally see that there was something fishy about this so-called disagreement. It was just that the ownerless Zechen Legion was too tempting, and some of the nobles couldn't help but be tempted. And under the competition, it was naturally impossible to come up with a unified candidate. As for the attack from the northern wilderness, for the important people in the capital of the Bran, it was a bit far away. Wenslin couldn't help but ask, could it be that before Z killed his way into the northern wilderness, he didn't think about appointing the next marshal? Haida shook his head. Wu Ding suddenly let out a long sigh. That idiot? He wanted to say something, but in the end, he didn't say anything. Haida looked at his teacher and nodded slightly, as if he agreed with this assessment. Not many people knew about the matter between Z and the Northern Wilderness Empress, but there were still some people who knew. This included Wu Ding, Haida, and the king of the Bran. This way, even if they knew that Z had never betrayed the Bran in his life, this matter concerned the safety of the country. Z had already appointed the next marshal, so how could the royal court agree so easily just in case? Then what do we do now? Wencelin was born in a noble family, so he naturally knew how fierce the struggle for benefits was. In the face of such temptation, unless the king personally made the decision, no one would compromise. Even if the king made an appearance, it wouldn't be randomly appointed. He would consider the interests of all the nobles, so he was probably having a headache over this problem. After thinking for a while, Wu Ding looked at Haida and said, "Although I've never joined the army, I know that foreign helpers can't be the foreman. Tell the king that the new marshal of the Zichen Legion can only be chosen from the 8 generals of the Zichen 8 armies." Yes. Haida nodded and didn't look surprised. In reality, this was the best decision. Firstly, the new marshal was born in the Zichen Legion, so he didn't need to familiarize himself with them. Secondly, it directly avoided the interests of the nobles. Didn't they want to fight for it? Let's just make it so that they can't fight for it. It was worth mentioning that someone must have thought of this a long time ago, but they just lacked someone who could control the nobles. The God of Swords Wu Ding undoubtedly had the ability to control the situation, so he was the most suitable candidate. In just a few short words, he solved the problem that had been debated in the Empire's parliament for more than half a year. This was the prestige and deterrence of the God of Swords Wu Ding in this world where the strong preyed on the weak. In addition to the northern wilderness and the army, the recent turmoil also came from the Temple of Light. Pause for a while. Haida slightly raised the corner of his mouth and emphasized, "This is also the biggest turmoil." The Temple of Light? Wencelin curled his lips. Those guys who pretend to be mysterious, what did they do this time? The Temple of Light's position in the Bran Empire was unquestionable, but not everyone would give them face. At least, the God of Swords people were not among them. This could be seen from Haida's smile and Wencelin's joking tone. As for the reason, it was more complicated. To put it simply, there couldn't be 2 tigers on one mountain. Everyone knew that the Bran Empire was closely linked to the royal and divine authority. The influence of the Temple of Light was deep in every area of the Bran. This was definitely not an exaggeration. But now there was a power that could also influence the royal authority, the God of Swords faction. Naturally, the Temple of Light was unwilling to accept this. As time went by, conflicts began to arise. Among all the conflicts, the main conflict was because of Zhuofan. Zhuofan didn't want to leave the City of Dawn, so he took the initiative to explode a crystal and died. But the Temple of Light undoubtedly played an important role in this. It was because of their leadership that the Grey Coat army was surrounded and suppressed, and Zhuofan was forced to a dead end. Because of this, the God of Swords faction undoubtedly hated the Temple of Light. As expected, a trace of pain flashed in Wu Ding's turbid eyes when he heard this. He thought of his most valued disciple and smiled as he asked, "What kind of turmoil?" "It's very turbulent. The influence of the Temple of Light in the north has almost been destroyed. The believers have collectively rioted, and the clergy have suffered heavy casualties. If there are no accidents, it's only a matter of time before they are chased out of the north." "What? Really?" Wencelin's involuntary exclamation might have been due to his temperament. But even Wu Ding, who had experienced many storms and waves in his life, couldn't help but doubt that he had heard wrongly. One could imagine the intense shock brought by this news. Sea Tower nodded heavily. "It's true. Now, the Temple of Light is forcefully blocking the news and putting out fires everywhere. But he chuckled. With Sea Tower's position in the court, it was naturally not difficult for him to obtain this news. Haha! After confirming the authenticity of this news, Wu Ding suddenly patted the straw mat beside him and laughed without restraint. He was like a child taking pleasure in other people's misfortune. In an instant, his laughter rumbled like thunder. It passed through the surrounding bamboo forest and reverberated in the air above Wu Ding's small residence for a long time. Everyone in the surrounding space raised their heads in shock. This was the laughter of the God of Swords? After the shock, they looked at each other in confusion. What had happened to make the god of swords so happy? Perhaps only Sea Tower and Wenslin could understand why their teacher was so happy. Zhuofan's death was indeed a huge blow to the god of swords Wu Ding. But due to his own influence and the peace of the empire, Wu Ding naturally couldn't raise his sword and kill his way to the Temple of Light headquarters to seek revenge. But now that he heard that the other party had fallen into such a difficult situation, he was naturally very happy and carefree. Sea Tower didn't hide his joy and continued with a smile. I also heard that the Temple of Light headquarters is very chaotic because of this. The Puritans and ascetics, who have always ignored worldly matters, have joined forces to criticize the higher-ups of the Temple of Light. The Pope must be having a hard time recently. Ha, it's worth celebrating, it's worth celebrating. Clapping his hands and laughing, Wu Ding picked up the bamboo fishing rod beside him and waved it casually. The thin silk line drew a faint trace on the calm lake surface. With a pull, 7 or 8 fat fish jumped out of the water, twisting their bodies and swinging their tails, splashing water droplets. Looking carefully, these fish weren't pulled out of the water because they had bitten the hook. There was no hook at the end of the silk line. And the reason for the harvest was that the thin silk line was like a fine needle, accurately piercing through the cheeks of each fish and lifting them up. Go, go, bring a knife and a pot. Rolling up his sleeves, Wu Ding grinned and laughed. I'm in a good mood today, so I'll personally cook a fish feast for you. Oh, bring more bowls, everyone outside will have fish soup to drink. Who made me happy, haha. Seeing their teacher so happy, Sea Tower and Wenslin, as his disciples, were naturally happy too. They responded in unison and stood up to get the cutlery. At this time, Wu Ding suddenly thought of something and asked Sea Tower, by the way, who could bring such a big surprise to the temple? Tang-en, it should be this name. Well, it needs to be said that he is a member of the Grey Coat Army. Grey Coat Army? Wu Ding raised his head in surprise, then blinked his turbid old eyes and looked very emotional. This is retribution. No, I must break the rule today. Bring me another pot of wine. For this I must drink 3 big bowls of wine. Although Wu Ding's small residence was located in a remote area, there was naturally no shortage of tableware. The only thing that could be said to be lacking was wine. For the sake of his teacher's health, Sea Tower had taken away all the wine here a few years ago. However, this was not a problem. Wenslin flew away, and in just a few minutes, he brought back a bottle of his teacher's favorite wine from the capital. Immediately, there was a burst of work in the backyard pond. Wu Ding personally took care of the fish, and Sea Tower and Wenslin helped to clean up the few fat fish. It was also at this time, Sea Tower thought of something, and after a moment of doubt, he asked, Teacher, do you think there is a secret manual in this world that can quickly improve battle chi? Chapter 857. Master, do you think there are any secret manuals in this world that can quickly increase one's dou chi? When Silen's hand movements paused as he turned his head with a smile, putting on an old and wise look as he said, Senior brother, practicing dou chi is not easy, one must be down-to-earth and diligent. Before his words fell, when Silen was the first to laugh. Obviously, these were the words that Hai Ta often taught him. Now that he took the opportunity to counterattack, he was naturally overjoyed. The corner of Wu Ding's mouth also had a faint smile, but this was naturally not meant to ridicule. He was very clear about his eldest disciple's character. He would not do things that were impatient for quick results. He raised his head and said, Dou Chi training is indeed not a shortcut, but things in the world have never been fixed. Some natural treasures, magical beast crystals, and other things of good fortune can greatly increase one's dou chi in a short period of time. As for secret manuals, well, there are some that can achieve such an effect. What? When Silen was shocked when he heard this. He could still remain calm when it came to natural treasures. With his background, he didn't care at all. In fact, the reason he was able to touch the threshold of void at such a young age was precisely because of such help. But after all, it was a foreign object and could only be used for a while. Secret manuals that could quickly increase one's do-chi were different. For example, natural treasures could let people take the lead on the starting line. And with such a heaven-defying secret manual, it would let people take the lead all the way. Thinking of this, when Silen was suddenly excited and asked in a trembling voice, "Master, is there really such a secret manual?" "There are indeed some, but you are never allowed to have this idea." Wu Ding's expression suddenly became extremely serious. Everything in this world is between gains and losses. Some evil secret techniques can increase one's do-chi cultivation speed in a short period of time, but the price to pay is equally huge. If it's light, one's cultivation will be crippled, and if it's heavy, one will lose one's life. All of you remember this? This was a beating. Sea Tower and Winston's expressions turned cold when they heard this, and they bowed in unison. Wu Ding nodded when he saw this, and then remembered Haita's previous question. Since this eldest disciple, who was as steady as a mountain, couldn't help but ask such a question, he couldn't help but feel a little curious. "What, did you encounter such an evil secret technique?" I'm not sure if it's an evil secret technique. By the way, this matter has something to do with the turmoil in the temple and Tang En." "Tell me." Haida explained in detail. "A few days ago, when I entered the hall to teach, I happened to meet the palace's grand priest. When we were chatting, he said that the reason why the temple was in such a difficult situation in the north was mainly because Tang En had taken out a secret manual that could rapidly increase the cultivation speed of do-chi. He used the heads of the clergy as a reward for the secret manual and secretly manipulated countless do-chi warriors in the north to attack the temple one after another. F***ck. This person is too ruthless, this move is too ruthless." Opening his mouth, when Silen was dazed as he thought about the warriors who had come here for the secret technique, covering the sky and covering the earth like a swarm of locusts. He couldn't help but tremble and curse. Under such a terrifying human wave tactic, let alone the Temple of Light, even the Empire wouldn't be able to withstand it. Wu Ding also frowned. This wasn't because his disciple was vulgar, but because he thought that once this secret technique spread, the consequences would be unimaginable. Once the countless warriors suffered a backlash. He subconsciously classified this secret technique as an evil secret technique. As if he knew what his teacher was thinking, Haida continued, "The temple didn't seem to be able to solve this problem, so after meeting me, the palace's grand priest gave me a copy of the secret technique information they had investigated through old Sir Clarence." Father?" Hearing Haida mention old Sir Clarence, when Silen couldn't help but be stunned. "You want to help but can't bring yourself to do it. What a good idea." Snorting lightly, Wu Ding curled his lips slightly, seemingly disdainful. The Temple of Light's foundation in do-chi and magic was naturally extremely profound, but if one wanted to study it carefully, they would study the field of magic more deeply. After all, healing magic was the foundation of their religion. Now that they saw that there was no progress in the secret technique, and they couldn't produce solid evidence to prove that this secret technique was harmful, they naturally thought of asking for help. And the best person to ask for help was undoubtedly the strongest person in the brand, Sword God Wu Ding. However, because of the many contradictions between the two sides, the temple also knew that if they rashly came to ask for help, not only would they not be able to get help, it was more likely that they would be humiliated. So they asked a middleman, Silen's father, to pass the message on his behalf. In this way, the Sword God's faction naturally couldn't directly refuse. This undoubtedly showed that the temple's side was having a headache over this secret technique and had put in a lot of effort. "Master." When Silen opened his mouth. Although he was proud, he was definitely not stupid. He knew that his father was being used as a tool to bring trouble to his master's side. But this was also a helpless matter. His family was not small, and there were many places where they had dealings with the temple. Even if Sir Carlrance knew the inside story, it would be difficult for him to refuse. It doesn't matter. Waving his hand casually, Wu Ding put down the knife in his hand and wiped the rag. I'm also a little curious. I'd like to see this secret technique that even the temple can't solve. Well, Hai-Ta, you continue. Wen Silin nodded. Yes. In fact, this secret technique information has been in disciples' hands for a few days. I didn't want to disturb Master. But, well, disciples' knowledge is shallow, and I really can't tell whether this is evil or not. Wu Ding raised his eyebrows in surprise. Although Hai-Ta's eldest disciple was not talented, he had been with him for the longest time, and his knowledge was impeccable. But now, even he was a little uncertain, which made Wu Ding really curious. At this time, Hai-Ta took out a few thin sheets of paper from his bosom and handed them forward. This is part of the secret technique that the temple found from the captured martial artists. It seems to be related to the body. The body? Wu Ding was a little surprised when he heard this, and then he thought of something. His face couldn't help but become serious. He took the few pages and looked down with narrowed eyes. Winston's curiosity was also piqued. He took a few steps forward and raised his eyes to sneak a peek at the few pages of paper in his master's hands. There were no words. What entered his eyes were just some messy lines, like scribbles. There was no pattern at all. He was startled and blinked. How could this be considered a secret technique? Unlike the baffled Wen Silin, Wu Ding frowned slightly and looked very solemnly. After thoroughly flipping through the few pages, he slowly closed his eyes and stretched out his finger to draw something in the air. If his finger was turned into a feather pen, dyed with black ink, and fell on the paper, it would be a simple and abstract portrait of a human body. A cool breeze blew, and the bamboo leaves rustled. After a long while, Wu Ding slowly opened his eyes, looked up and sighed. A genius! With a faint sigh, the pond in the bamboo forest was dead silent. Hai-Ta and Wen Silin's body stiffened when they heard this. They stood there in a daze, unable to come back to their senses. People were born with different levels of talent. It seemed unfair, but this was a gift from the heavens. Mortals couldn't do anything about it. But from the words of the sword god, just what level of talent was this heaven-bestowed genius? Hai-Ta didn't know. He only knew that among the 3 disciples of the sword god, Wen Silin's talent was the highest. But when his master saw Wen Silin that day, he only said, "Your talent is not bad, you can join my sect." His innate talent wasn't bad, and he was a heaven-sent genius. Anyone could see the difference between the two. In an instant, Wen Silin felt very uncomfortable. Of course, he didn't dare to refute Wu Ding's judgment. He just pointed at the few pages and said unconvinced, "These messy lines are so bad?" Wu Ding naturally understood the personality of this youngest disciple. If it was any other time, he would at most smile slightly, and then beat him up when he had the chance. But he didn't do that now. He waved a few pages of paper and said faintly, "Your master's current achievements mainly rely on these messy lines and drawings." Wen Silin was stunned when he heard this. He didn't have time to think about the shocking information in these words. He lowered his head in fear. "Master, I'm not." Waving his hand, Wu Ding didn't have the intention to continue beating Wen Silin. This also made Hai-Ta, who was about to step forward, secretly breathe a sigh of relief. Then he couldn't help but think of the words just now. Master could become the sword god because of this secret art? It had to be said that the information revealed in these words was really shocking. Because of this seemingly inconspicuous secret art, it actually created Bran to be the strongest. If this news was accidentally spread, the entire Shiha continent would be plunged into a storm of blood because of this secret art. At this time, Wu Ding opened his mouth, his expression full of melancholy. I didn't want to let you come into contact with this so early, but now that we've met, let's talk about it. A few decades ago, I had an old friend who was antisocial and liked to live in remote and barren mountains, so he wasn't famous. He once said that there was a world in the human body. First, cultivate the body, then draw dou qi into the body, and finally control the dou qi of heaven and earth. This is the common path for warriors to step onto the path of dou qi for thousands of years. But that old friend of mine thought that there was a world in the human body, so he cultivated the outside but not the inside. In fact, he had gone astray, and his achievements in life were limited. Cultivate the inside, how do you cultivate it? Wen Silin asked subconsciously. Do you still remember the feeling when you first entered the earth level? Wu Ding looked at Hai Ta and Wen Silin in front of him, and answered his own question. There is a limit to the amount of dou qi that can be stored in the human body. When you reach the peak of a high-level warrior, your dou qi will be extremely abundant. At this time, if you have the opportunity to break the barrier between the inside and outside, you will be able to see a whole new world, feel the world's dou qi, and control it as much as possible. This is the cultivation of the outside. And the so-called cultivation of the inside is to go the opposite way, to operate the cultivation of the world in the body. There is no need to waste time controlling the surrounding dou qi, and let it be attracted by itself, gradually expanding the world in the body. This disciple doesn't understand. Hai Ta frowned. This so-called cultivation of the inside, isn't it the cultivation of drawing dou qi into the body before the earth level? Teacher just said that the dou qi that can be stored in the human body is limited. It's different, very different. Wu Ding shook his head. The cultivation of the present world, drawing dou qi into the body before the earth level, is only temporarily keeping the dou qi in the body, not increasing or increasing. Because it can't break the barrier between the inside and outside, it will gradually decline as the body ages. This is clearly a pool of stagnant water. How can it be a lively world? He raised both hands and spread out his 5 fingers. The real world has the rotation of the sun and the moon, wind and rain, thunder and lightning, the singing of birds and the fragrance of flowers. Everything is moving, it is alive. The world in the body should be like this. So my old friend moved the dou qi in the body, wanting to create a world in the body. After countless attempts, he accidentally discovered that there was a world in the body, it's just that we can't see it, we can't touch it, that's all. At this point, Wu Ding raised his arm and casually drew an area in front of his chest. It's such a small area, if cut and cut, it's just flesh and blood. But who knows that in this flesh and blood, there are countless tiny channels that can't be seen by the naked eye, just like the endless circulation roads in the capital of Bran. Countless tiny channels. When Silin heard this and subconsciously looked down at his chest, his expression blank. Are there? Yes, Wu Ding said firmly. Although it can't be seen, my old friend did move the dou qi into these channels. After a little test, the dou qi actually circulated on its own in the channels, and every time it finished a cycle, the dou qi would increase by a little. It was endless. It's alive. It's really alive. At this point, although the past was mentioned again, Wu Ding's face was still flushed, and he clenched his fists tightly, looking very excited. Wu Ding's excitement was because the world in the body was alive, and because his old friend had finally succeeded. However, the main point that Wen Silin heard was that after the cycle, the dou qi would increase on its own. What did this mean? This meant that as long as he grasped this cultivation method, his strength would increase every moment. In this way, who in the world could be a match for him? Under the surging emotions, he blurted out, "Master, why have you never taught us this?" Perhaps Wen Silin did not have any other intentions in his questioning tone, but when he said those words, they were words that cut to the heart. Impudent! On the side, Hai Ta was in a state of infinite shock. Hearing this, he immediately reacted and roared angrily, glaring fiercely at Wen Silin. How can you question Master's actions? Why don't you hurry up and apologize to Master? Although he was angry at Wen Silin's disrespect, he also faintly wanted to protect him. For a moment, Wen Silin did not understand his senior brother's good intentions, but he also knew that his words were too shameless. Cold sweat instantly climbed to his temples, and his face was full of panic and fear. He bent his knees and was about to kneel and beg for forgiveness. However, before he could kneel, Wu Ding waved his sleeve, and an invisible force lifted him up again. His expression was calm, and there was no sign of anger. He continued indifferently, "The reason why I didn't teach you is because 3 months after my old friend discovered this channel, he suddenly vomited blood and died. Before he died, he burned down the entire research institute, saying that this channel was blocked. Then he died in front of my eyes." When Silin cried out involuntarily. Hearing this, it was as if a basin of cold water had been poured over his head, and he was extremely dispirited. Hai Ta was also greatly shocked. This channel in the body. There's a problem? Although Wu Ding did not go into detail, to be able to become his old friend, that person's strength and cultivation were undoubtedly extremely terrifying. However, it was precisely this kind of peerless expert that had suddenly died, so this channel naturally became a dangerous existence that no one should touch. Wu Ding nodded and sighed deeply. There is indeed a problem, but I don't know if there's a problem with all the channels. I only know that there are many, many channels. Can't we try them one by one? When Silin was still a little unwilling. Raising a finger, Wu Ding said, "Do you know that within this finger, there are countless channels that are so complicated that they dazzle the eyes? Among them, some channels can be entered, and although some channels are dead ends, they are fortunately not dangerous. As long as you enter some channels, you will definitely die. And even if it's a channel that can be entered for a while, how can you guarantee that there won't be any hidden fatal dangers? Like my old friend, who suddenly vomited blood and died 3 months later? Try them one by one. How? Use the lives of tens of thousands of warriors to fill it? Is it enough?" Wu Ding shook his head and sighed. "This channel is blocked, this channel is blocked." If Tangen was here, he would certainly agree with Wu Ding's point of view. The complete circulation channel in his hands was now because of the old butler and the system's help. Therefore, even if there were tens of thousands of possibilities, he could still calculate the correct path. But what about others without the help of the system? Was he really going to gamble with tens of thousands of warriors? Not to mention whether or not it would succeed, how to transfer so many warriors who were willing to die was an extremely unrealistic problem. After sighing for a while, Wu Ding's expression gradually returned to normal. He looked at the 2 disciples in front of him and said, "There is indeed something I haven't taught you. Although my old friend thinks that this channel is blocked, he also found a few channel nodes during his research. He thinks that this is safe, so he gave me the location. You also know that the reason why I have my current cultivation is because of the technique of constantly compressing and condensing my douqi. But other than that, what you don't know is that even after the compression and condensation of douqi, it far exceeds the limit that my body can bear. I put the condensed douqi into the nodes, and it's very amazing. It's clearly just a tiny, inconspicuous point, but it can accommodate a huge amount of douqi." Pause for a while. "And the reason why I haven't taught you this is because the douqi in your bodies is far from being saturated, so there's no need to use such methods." "I'm sorry, Master." Hearing this, Wen Silin was abnormally ashamed. He lowered his head, wishing that he could shrink his head directly into his chest. Wu Ding shook his head slightly. "It's fine. I know that you are proud and arrogant, and want to climb to the peak of martial arts. But you have to remember that shortcuts are often dead ends. Don't be too anxious for success, learn more from your senior. Yes, master. When Sillin nodded repeatedly. Not to mention whether he cared or not, but his current attitude was still good. After taking the opportunity to knock, Wu Ding looked at the few pages in his hand, and his expression was extremely complicated. If it weren't for the fact that the position of the secret channel on this is not correct, I would have thought that my old friend's things were not completely burned. I didn't expect that after so many years, someone would set foot in this dangerous area. Tang En? Well, no matter what, he is a genius, and it's worth going to see him. After saying this, Hai Ta and Wen Sillin's bodies shook together, and they raised their heads in shock, their faces full of shock. Master, Sword God is going down the mountain? Chapter 858. Because of the difference in location, although people with extraordinary identities like Hai Ta could be considered well-informed, that was only relative to ordinary people. In fact, while they were discussing, the current situation of the Northern Temple was much worse than they had expected. Of course, in the same way, Tang En was completely unaware of the news that the Sword God had quietly left the mountain and went to the north. By the Hanshui River, all kinds of craftsmen were still standing, but the prosperous atmosphere of the past was no longer there. Walking among them, most of the passers-by looked anxious and uneasy. Even if they were acquaintances, they would not greet them and would walk in a hurry. In fact, this kind of atmosphere was not only here, but also in the whole Hanshui city, and even in the whole northern Bran. It was like being shrouded by a large mass of dark clouds, oppressive and oppressive. The reason for this oppressive atmosphere, needless to say, was naturally because of the Temple of Light. At this point, the problem brought by the temple was no longer as simple as a simple problem of faith. The temple had stood on the mainland for thousands of years, and had long penetrated into every inch of the Brand's territory, every class, and the hearts of every Brand citizen. It was precisely because of such a huge influence that once the temple faced a real crisis, it would be the trouble of the entire Bran Empire. And this kind of terrible trouble could not be solved in a short period of time by the Bran Imperial Court, nor could the Temple of Light. As for Tang En, the main person involved, in fact, even if they killed Tang En, the root of the disaster, now, it was impossible to reverse the situation. This was a completely irresistible trend that couldn't be resisted. It could be foreseen that in the end, it was destined to become an unmanageable disaster. On the riverside street, yellow leaves were spinning and drifting. It's really deserted. Coming out of the secret purple cannon factory, Lena and Tang En walked in the bleak autumn wind. Looking at the bleak street, Lena could not help but sigh. Tang En did not say anything. He naturally knew the reason and source of all the scenes in front of him. Although he would never regret making such a decision, looking at this lifeless scene, he naturally would not jump for joy like a great demon king proudly announcing that this was the effect he wanted. Looking around, Lena lowered her head and said softly, "The day before yesterday, I was chatting with Aunt Martha at the tailor shop. She said that old Father Primo of the church in the west of the city was dead and his head was cut off. She was very sad. Oh, I don't mean to blame you, Arthur. I know you must have your own reasons for doing this. I just heard that old Father Primo was a good man. It's fine." Tang En shook his head gently, indicating that he didn't mind. Lena was one of the most important factors in the revival of the Grey Coat Army. Tang En didn't hide some things from her. For example, the purpose of the purple bore cannon, and the bloodshed caused by the assassin organization. Of course, he didn't mention the specifics, as there was no need to. However, Lena still knew that the large-scale killing of the northern clergy came from Tang En. After a moment of silence, Tang En nodded. "I believe in your judgment. That old priest should be a good man. I also believe that there are many such good people in the temple. But this is war. Tang En raised his head and looked at the gray and bleak sky. He paused and continued, on the battlefield, the enemy and I meet on a narrow path. Perhaps the enemy in front of me is a good man in the eyes of his neighbors in his hometown, a good son in the eyes of his parents, and a good husband in the eyes of his wife. He also has 2 or 3 lively and cute children and a loyal big black dog. But we are enemies. If I don't make a move, he will stab me to death with the long spear in his hand. What can I do? I can only raise the big sword in my hand and chop off his head first. No matter how noble his character is, or how happy his family is. This is war. There will always be people dying, and I want to live. Turning his head to look at Lena, who was in a daze, Tang En's expression was calm. I didn't say so much to refute anything. I am a very selfish person. I will never be able to reach the level of a saint who can help the world. The starting point of doing things is only for myself and the people around me. I can't take care of others, and I don't want to take care of them. Well, are you disappointed? Lena shook her head silently, then shook her head again. She took a deep breath and said, No, I won't. I understand. I just feel a little emotional. Well, it seems that no matter what, the unlucky ones are always the ordinary people. They won't be unlucky for long. Tang En looked towards the west, and the corners of his mouth curled up slightly. Thanks to you, an injured tiger is recovering at an accelerated rate. It will come out to hunt for food soon. Hearing this, Lena was stunned, and then followed Tang En's gaze to the west. A thought suddenly appeared in her mind, and she immediately showed a shocked expression. Gray robe. She covered her mouth in time and looked at the passers-by around her. Yes. Tang En smiled and nodded. He could not help but feel emotional. It was not easy. The day had finally arrived. Needless to say, this ferocious tiger from the north was naturally the Grey Coat Army from the depths of the 100,000 mountains. Actually, there was no need to rush this step. During the battle in the City of Dawn, the main forces of the Grey Coat Army did not suffer much damage. However, the deaths of Rosa, Zwafan, and the other high-ranking officials, as well as the betrayal of Bosco and the other high-ranking officials, had undoubtedly cast a shadow over the Grey Coat Army. Their morale had plummeted. In addition, without a stronghold to defend, the 100,000 soldiers of the Grey Coat Army were like rootless duckweeds. Compared to the countless sturdy cities of the Bran Empire and the tens of thousands of strong soldiers, they had no chance of winning. It could be said that if it were not for the intense anger of revenge burning in the hearts of every Grey Coat Army member, with this battle, more than half of the Grey Coat Army would have been disbanded. Later, Josiah rose to power under Rosa's will and became the leader in one fell swoop. Then, he dug out the parasites and eradicated the rebels, greatly stabilizing the morale of the army. However, the huge difference in strength between the enemy and their side still made all the Grey Coat Army members confused. They could not see any hope of revenge. Helpless, the Grey Coat Army decided to grit their teeth and lay low for a few years. They would slowly plan and wait for the time of revenge to come. However, at this time, Tang En returned from the northern wilderness with the purple bore cannon. After that, they were even luckier. Not only did they meet Lena, who had outstanding alchemy talent, but they also had the secret support of the Yatong business group. Batch after batch of improved purple bore cannons were delivered one after another. And with such a weapon of mass destruction in their hands, and after witnessing its terrifying power, the morale of the Grey Coat Army was naturally greatly boosted. They were sharpening their swords and thinking about how to take revenge after a year of silence. Of course, this was just a preliminary idea. After all, the significance of this revenge was too great. If they were defeated again, the outcome would be unpredictable. But coincidentally, Tang En had caused quite a commotion in this year. He had directly stirred up a pot of porridge in the north. It was a great opportunity to take revenge. Therefore, in the secret letter that Tang En received a few days ago, Josiah and the others finally decided to lead the Gray Coat Army to officially take revenge at the beginning of this year's winter. There was a tiger in the West Mountain. It would climb high and roar angrily, baring its fangs. It would definitely shake the world and cause all beasts to flee in panic. After knowing this shocking news, the two of them naturally didn't have the mood to be emotional. But on the way back to the alchemy laboratory, they were somewhat silent. Tangan was looking forward to it. He had a premonition that the situation in the West Marsh continent was likely to change because of this variable. Lena also looked happy, but it was difficult to hide her somewhat absent-minded expression. She was really satisfied with her current life, and even more so with the way she interacted with Tangan. She wasn't greedy at all. She just quietly watched and felt happy. But thinking about how the Gray Coat Army would walk out of the 100,000 mountains, and how Miss Josiah would appear by his side, this kind of life would be gone forever. They walked silently to a place not far from the alchemy laboratory. Tangan, who was about to say goodbye, looked up and saw two carriages parked in front of the laboratory. One was an ordinary black carriage, and the other was a small and exquisite red carriage. More than 10 guards were scattered around with vigilant expressions. He couldn't help but be slightly startled and turned to look at Lena. "Hey, this is Alan's carriage." Lena was also a little surprised when she saw this, but she immediately recognized that the ordinary black carriage was Alan's and was somewhat happy. "Ha, it's Alan. It's really been a long time since we last met." Tangan was also happy when he heard this. Then, his gaze fell on the exquisite red carriage at the side. He smiled and joked, "Haha, it seems that this kid is doing well. He found a girlfriend and came to show off." Chapter 859. P.S. Well, everyone seems to have misunderstood. Civet is used to thinking of writing as 3 parts: the beginning, middle, and end. When he said that it was about to end, he didn't mean that it would end immediately. He only said that it was about to end and that there was still some time to write. In short, don't worry, Civet will definitely fill in the holes before the end. Carrot. After entering the alchemy laboratory, Tang En discovered that he had the potential to become a prophet. "Haha, Alan, it really is you." Big Sister Lena. "Tang. Mr. Arthur? You are also here, haha, what a coincidence." Alan, who had a short beard and had a mature manly aura, laughed heartily as he walked over. He greeted Tang En and hugged him, patting each other's back. They were both somewhat excited. After separating, Alan spread his hands and gestured to the tall young woman next to him as he smiled and introduced. "This is Miss Annika. Miss Annika, this is Big Sister Lena, and this is Mr. Arthur. They are my closest relatives." Tang En sized up the young woman called Annika and was slightly taken aback. His first impression of her was that she looked familiar. Of course, this was not an excuse for him to strike up a conversation with her. Tang En quickly discovered the reason for her familiarity, and could not help but glance at Lena beside him. Lena and Annika looked at each other, both of them a little surprised, because they both found some similarities with each other. Standing together, the two of them were of similar height and had similar facial features. But their temperaments were completely different. Lena was calm and indifferent. This was related to her identity as a master alchemist. Annika was elegant and refined. She should have a good background. After a pause, Tang En and Lena recovered and smiled as they greeted. "Nice to meet you, Miss Annika." She lowered her white lace hat and bowed slightly. She politely returned the greeting. "Mr. Arthur, Miss Lena, nice to meet you." After greeting each other, they didn't chat much. Alan quickly found an excuse to have Annika and Lena chat while he and Tang En walked away. "I'm sorry, sir. I was careless. I didn't expect you to be here when I came." Alan looked a little apologetic. One had to know that Tang En was not in disguise now, which meant that this was the real face of the person wanted by the entire continent. Once exposed, it would undoubtedly bring huge trouble to Tang En, Lena, and Alan himself. I'm fine. Tang En waved his hand carelessly and grinned self-deprecatingly. With my ordinary face, I guarantee that she will forget about me after seeing me. You're quite fast. I didn't see you bring anyone the last time we met. He patted Alan's shoulder and gave him a thumbs up. This Annika is your girlfriend, right? TSK, she's a noble lady. Good taste. Tang En's eyes were very sharp. With just a glance and observing Annika's elegant and standard manners, he could confirm that she was a noble lady. And if he guessed correctly, she should be a noble lady from the south. Alan didn't deny it and nodded with a smile. Annika's family does have some nobility. I met her by chance at a banquet in a southern city. Sir, you should be able to see that she looks a little similar to Sister Lena, so we chatted for a while. At that time, her family was in some trouble in the business world, so I got to know her. Tang En laughed. I get it now. The hero saves the beauty, and the beauty marries him. Haha, so you're really here to show off. Sir, you're joking with me again. Alan shrugged helplessly, then his expression turned serious and he said respectfully, Alan's achievements today are all because I met Sir and Sister Lena. Otherwise, Alan would forever be a poor boy in the slums who dreamed of getting rich. You're my only family in this world, so after meeting Annika, I wanted to find a chance to bring her here to meet you and listen to your opinions. Tang En couldn't help but be stunned when he heard this. His expression was a little complicated. He was gratified by Alan's attitude after achieving success, and also proud of his own vision. He patted Alan's shoulder. Don't say that. Your achievements today are all because of your own hard work. Even without me, you can still succeed. I have no doubts about this. After saying this resolutely, Tang En turned to look at Annika. He suddenly felt very strange, like a father looking at the daughter-in-law his son brought back. He suddenly felt a chill. Seeing Tang En's strange expression, Alan asked nervously, What's wrong, sir? Oh, nothing. Cough, cough. Tang En coughed twice and awkwardly rubbed his nose. Only now did he really focus on Annika. It had to be said that looking at Lena and Annika standing together and chatting, Tang En really felt like he was looking at two beautiful sisters. It was very pleasing to the eye. Perhaps it was because of this that the two of them had a very harmonious conversation. However, if he ignored these superficial phenomena, Tang En still felt a little unnatural from Annika. There was a faint hostility. It wasn't the kind of hostility that would kill you, but the kind of hostility that women would have towards each other. Of course, this degree was very slight. It was hidden under Annika's elegant behavior and was almost undetectable. In fact, it was this kind of elegance that allowed Tang En to see some clues. As the saying goes, 3 generations of nobility. The elegant temperament of nobility wasn't innate, but rather, it was formed under the influence of the environment and the accumulation of time. Just like how Tang En could see that Annika was a noble lady, Annika should also be able to see that Lena came from an ordinary background. In this way, the scene in front of him was somewhat interesting. Alan's previous introduction had already stated Lena's important position in his heart. Logically speaking, Annika should be trying to curry favor with Lena. Even if it wasn't obvious, it would still be a way to express her attitude. But now, the situation was exactly the opposite. Annika was using her family background to secretly suppress Lena. Could it be that this is the incompatibility between beautiful women? Tang En raised his eyebrows and thought about it. Although he didn't approve of Annika's attitude towards Lena, it was only a small matter. He dismissed it with a smile and didn't take it to heart. He turned around and looked at the nervous Alan. He nodded and praised, Not bad, she's a good girl. I can see that she cares a lot about you since she accompanied you all the way to the north. You're lucky. You can't let her down in the future. How could I? Alan was obviously relieved when he heard this. He smiled and said, "If Sir says she's good, then she's really good." Tang En rolled his eyes when he heard this. "TSK, what are you talking about? Are you looking for a girlfriend? Or am I looking for a girlfriend?" Hee hee. Alan chuckled and scratched his head in embarrassment. He then looked at Annika, who was chatting happily with Lena. A gentle expression flashed across his face. "Then it's her. Who would have thought?" Shaking his head, Alan sighed emotionally. "I'm just a poor boy from the slums. I can't believe I'm able to marry a noble lady. Hee hee, the world is really unpredictable. You're blatantly showing off." Haha. I can't compare to you, sir." Alan turned to look at Tang En with a smile. "I heard from Sister Lena about Sir and Miss Josiah's relationship. Yes, Josiah is both a noble and a magician. Sir, you're the one who's really lucky." Tang En grinned when he heard this. "You forgot to mention her identity. She's also the leader of the rebel army." TSK, that's giving me a lot of pressure. She's the leader of the rebel army now, but it's hard to say in the future," Alan said with a teasing tone. "Besides, only you, sir, can enjoy such a wondrous woman. Haha, I really admire you when I think about it. If you're free one day, sir, why don't you teach me a thing or two?" They were all men. When it came to this topic, Tang En was supposed to agree and brag about it. However, for some reason, Tang En suddenly thought of Sylvia and Lan Sha. He suddenly felt a little guilty. He raised his head and laughed. "We'll talk about this in the future, haha." Chapter 860. Everything has its pros and cons. By releasing the Do Chi circulation channel, Tang En successfully created a situation where the Northern Warriors and the Temple of Light were at loggerheads with each other. In one fell swoop, the Temple of Light had been dragged into the abyss of the quagmire, unable to extricate itself. But it must be said that the temptation could make people have a strong motivation, but it could also make people greedy. In this world, there were many people who claimed to be smart and liked to take shortcut. What's more, most people who could receive a mission from an assassin organization were not honest and well-behaved people. Most of them were ruthless and sinister bounty hunters. After tasting the sweetness, they would no longer think about continuing to obtain the mission reward. Instead, they would calculate how to get the reward in one go. Tang En had naturally expected such a situation. So when he first started to issue missions, he personally took charge and killed a group of people with bad intentions with thunder, quickly establishing a stable foundation for the early assassin organization. Then, Michaud led the members of the Gray Space to secretly move out, running around, and constantly nipping at the bud of the conspiracy. But it had to be said that greedy people could never be killed. Even if they could easily smell the danger from various channels, the tempting prospect of profit had long overwhelmed their rationality. Just like the smugglers on the border, they were like carps crossing the river. Their red eyes were only filled with the huge profits after success, completely ignoring the fatal noose close at hand. It's okay. It's just that there are a lot of people who want to die. Since they wanted to die naturally, he would not hesitate to kill them. In such a situation, Tang En's idea was very simple. After listening to Michaud's summary of the current bad situation, he directly waved his hand and said, "Then continue to kill. The more brutal, the better. I don't believe that I can't stop this evil trend." Michaud nodded calmly. "Yes, I'm a professional." There was no need to show off, nor was there a need for slogans. For people who came from the gray space, killing people was a professional, just like farmers weeding, fishermen fishing, and so on. What's more, this was Michaud, Tang En's sharpest knife hidden in the dark. Tang En smiled and did not say much. He just pointed to the cup on the wooden table and waved his hand. "Tea? Or wine?" Michaud shook his head and stood up. "I'm going out to kill someone." He bowed and left. This was Michaud's style. Now, he was more silent and dangerous than before. It seemed that only by killing, and continuously killing, could he find some sense of existence in this world. However, as long as Tang En was still around, this dangerous killing was still under control. And for the enemy, it was naturally a nightmare of disaster. After Michaud left, the ordinary carriage naturally merged into the road and moved forward. Tang En's true face was not easily exposed, and it was troublesome to disguise himself every time he went out. Therefore, he now enjoyed the treatment of a private carriage. No matter where he went, there were people from the gray space who disguised themselves as coachmen to pick him up and drop him off. What? The garrison cavalry has already been here. But this is our area of jurisdiction, who would be faster than us? When they passed by the dilapidated tavern, the thick smoke had yet to completely disperse. At this time, the real garrison cavalry had just arrived. But looking at the confused expressions on their faces as they talked to the surrounding witnesses, it was obvious that they wouldn't be able to obtain any valuable clues. Ha ha! Tang En chuckled silently and put down the curtain. He touched his chin and began to think about the current situation. Although he had just said those words, Tang En was very clear that the matter of the assassin's organization would not end so easily. This was not something that could be stopped by killing a few people. Unless one day the assassin's organization could grow into a behemoth like the Temple of Light, it would be impossible to dispel the greed in the hearts of the greedy people. Since he could not find a solution himself, naturally, he would have to work on the source, but now the source. Tang En rubbed his eyebrows and looked a little confused. Damn it! What's the point of staying here like a half-dead mangy dog? These words were undoubtedly scolding the Temple of Light. In fact, up to now, the churches and countless clergy in the north had been damaged by more than half. It was not an exaggeration to say that the foundation of the Temple of Light in the north for thousands of years had collapsed. Retreat was the inevitable choice, otherwise, they could only watch the casualties continue to increase. However, no one knew what the Divine Palace was thinking. They would rather suffer huge losses at every moment than stay here. They had no intention of retreating. It was obvious that they were not going to leave. It really made people speechless. It was like two heavyweight boxers fighting in the ring. The lightweight boxer used all his strength and finally knocked down the heavyweight boxer. Just as he was about to win, the heavyweight boxer covered his face and curled up. Then, no matter how hard he was beaten, he refused to leave the ring. Although the lightweight boxer kept punching and kicking, because he lacked the ability to kill with one blow, he was helpless against this dog-like opponent. Sure enough, once people are shameless, they immediately become invincible in the world. With a long sigh, Tang En sighed helplessly. Little did he know that the Temple of Light was even more helpless at this time. They almost burst into tears. Now the north was a quagmire. No matter how many people they mobilized, it was useless. If they had known that a wanted order would lead to such consequences, they would rather break their teeth and swallow their blood directly into their stomach. Of course, at this time, the Temple of Light would not retreat no matter what. They knew very well that if they retreated, it would mean that the Temple of Light's influence in the north would completely disappear. And if they did not retreat, although the days would be difficult and their reputation would be miserable, as long as they could endure this period, with 1,000 years of foundation, they would still be the king of this vast land. In short, endure it. Tang En could naturally think of the Temple of Light's thoughts. Although he was dissatisfied before, he was also prepared for a long battle. But since receiving Josiah's letter, Tang En quickly changed his mind. Not leaving? Then when the Grey Coat army comes out, get ready to get lost. As for now, Tang En pursed his lips, still feeling unhappy. He had already boasted to Josiah in the letter that her man played the Temple of Light like a monkey and would soon drive them out of the north. But now, When Josiah came out of the 100,000 mountains and found that the Temple of Light was still here, where would he put his face? Would he still have his prestige as a man? Cha! Oh, beautiful lady, please forgive me for intruding. Madam? Oh my God! Sorry, I really couldn't tell. Do you know? Just now when you came from afar and walked into my eyes, in an instant, I felt that I had found the most beautiful scenery on this journey. Just when Tang En was very unhappy with the Temple of Light's tortoise strategy, such affectionate words that made women burst with joy and men tremble with disgust suddenly floated in from outside the car. Startled, Tang En subconsciously touched his nose. This voice, this dialogue. It felt a little familiar. If you don't mind, can you give me a few minutes? I want to freeze this beautiful scenery in my heart forever. Wow, did you agree? Thank you, beautiful and generous madam. I believe that I must have received the favor of the goddess of luck today. Hearing this, Tang En grinned and pulled open the curtains. He found that the carriage had arrived at the residence, which was the outer street of the secret organization. Looking around, he quickly found the source of the familiar voice on the side of the street. There were not many people on the street, and most of them looked hurried. Only in front of a clothing store was an elegant young woman in a luxurious dress gently stroking her hair. She stood still with a smile on her face, and there was an unconcealable joy in her expression. Not far in front of her was a man holding a drawing board. From time to time, he would look up at the young woman and chuckle. Then, he would lower his head to draw something, like a wandering painter who made a living by sketching people on the street. Although his back was facing her, Tang En looked up and down at the wandering painter. The corners of his mouth could not help but curl up slightly. It was really this playboy. After thinking about it, Tang En called for the carriage to stop. He picked up a wide-brimmed hat from the carriage and put it on his head. Then, he opened the curtain and walked down, sandwiched in the crowd, and walked toward the two people. Chapter 861. Let's rewind time to a few minutes ago, when the violent explosion in the tavern faintly echoed in the sky above the city. The residents outside the city stopped in their track. They didn't look up at the sky, thinking that it was just thunder in the clouds. Instead, they subconsciously looked around, their legs trembling, and their faces full of fear and uneasiness. In fact, from these small actions, one could see that the residents in the city were very insecure. Among the crowd, on the main road in the west of the city, there was an old man and a middle-aged man. They didn't look around in panic like the passers-by. Instead, they turned their heads to the north immediately, as if they were very sure that the explosion came from that direction. And that was indeed the case. I haven't been to the north for many years. I didn't expect it to become so chaotic here. Shaking his head slightly, the old man in green withdrew his gaze and sighed softly. It shouldn't have been like this in the past. The middle-aged man looked at the crowd that was hurriedly dispersing around him and frowned, hiding his anger. How dare they, Temple of Light? The situation has evolved to the point where everyone is in danger, and they still want to block the news from the north and south? Where is the safety of the empire? I was wondering why the northern wilderness tribes were in such a hurry to attack after suffering a great defeat last year. They should have seen the current situation in the north. The old man in green was quite broad-minded, mentioning the northern wilderness tribes as soon as he spoke. However, the middle-aged man didn't have the slightest doubt when he heard this. He nodded solemnly. That should be the case. This wasn't the same as making money to buy cabbages and worrying about selling white powder. Although everyone was responsible for the rise and fall of the world, they weren't ordinary people. However, they were not ordinary people. They were the objects of worship that ordinary people placed their hopes on, the god of swords, Wu Ding, and his eldest disciple, Haita. Of course, because Wu Ding hadn't left the mountain for many years, not to mention the residents of the north, Even the people in the capital of Bran might not be able to recognize him. Walking on the bustling streets of Hanshui City now, no one paid attention to this inconspicuous old farmer. Passing by in a hurry, no one knew that they had brushed shoulders with the Bran god of swords. They even nodded at him and smiled subconsciously. Wu Ding, on the other hand, had vaguely guessed the fuse of the great war that was soon to come. However, his expression remained calm as he walked casually along with the crowd. You were right earlier. The Imperium has indeed reached a time of turmoil. Hai Ta was still frowning. Master, what should we do? Oh? Then what should we do? When the tribes attack, the supplies and reinforcements to the front line have to pass through the north. Therefore, this place must be settled down, the sooner the better. His tone was resolute and decisive. Hai Ta's face was solemn. The main reason for the chaos in the north is the temple and Tang En. The influence of the temple is far-reaching, and the riot of believers is the biggest chaos at present. However, as long as war broke out and the Empire issued a notice regarding this matter, it should be able to temporarily suppress it. In this way, the only thing that can be considered chaotic is the battle between the temple and the countless warriors gathered by Twain using the secret manuals. Wu Ding nodded slightly, agreeing with his eldest disciple's analysis. He then asked calmly, "Then which side do you think we should stand on this time?" "The temple," Hai Ta said without hesitation. "When I came here, I investigated the situation of the temple. Now they are in a very difficult situation. Tang En has indeed made a good move. He has almost completely suppressed the forces of the temple in the north by himself. It's amazing. However, the temple would rather suffer continuous losses than withdraw from the north. It's a good move to seek survival in the midst of death. Now, as long as they don't take the initiative to retreat, Tang En can't drive them out of the north even if he has the ability to reach the heavens. The reason is that he doesn't have enough power. In Hai Ta's view, Tang En's biggest problem was that he didn't have enough power. Although the Gray Space and the secret organization were good, the scale of their forces was still too small. Although Twain could order the countless warriors controlled by the secret manual to attack the clergy, such attacks could not cause fatal damage to the temple in a short period of time, nor could he control them to drive the temple out of the north as if they were his own arms. Because such a requirement was too broad, the content of the mission was not easy to set. Tang En couldn't just write a mission to drive the temple out of the north. Even if someone accepted it, the warriors wouldn't know where to start. If the mission was divided into steps, it would still take time. In fact, this was Tang En's previous plan. At that time, he didn't know that the Gray Coat Army was coming, so when he saw that the temple was completely shameless, he was mentally prepared for a long battle. He expected to exhaust the other party bit by bit. Back to the main point. Tang En needed time, but Hai Ta, who knew that the northern wilderness was about to launch a large-scale attack, could not wait. Tang En didn't have enough power, so Hai Ta decided to stand on the temple's side. This decision was not mixed with any emotional factors. Although Hai Ta and Tang En had no friendship, the Sword God's faction did not have a good impression of the Temple of Light. Therefore, Hai Ta decided to stand on the temple's side because Tang En's power was small and easy to deal with. He could help them quell the chaos in the north in the shortest time. There was no other way. In the face of the general trend, although it was cruel to sacrifice the weak, this was the reality. Wu Ding nodded noncommittally. "How are you going to deal with Tang En?" "I'll definitely hand over the secret technique. As for this person..." Hai Ta hesitated and said, "Master, you said that he's a genius. I also admire him, especially when I know that he came from the Gray Coat Army and made the temple so embarrassed. Well, Philip has a good relationship with him. This time we were able to find this place so quickly because of him. Previously, you said that you wanted to see Tang En. If Winston didn't insist on going with you, he would definitely want to find Tang En alone. Obviously, he also saw something and wanted to report it. If we don't do something to Tang En, he may have an opinion. Of course, everything depends on Master. After saying a lot, he did not give any conclusion. It seemed that he was trying to shirk responsibility, but Wu Ding stopped and said with a smile, "It seems that you really admire him." Haita chuckled but didn't say anything. His previous words seemed to have a strong start and a weak finish, but if carefully analyzed, he actually said a lot of good things about Tang En. Coming from the Grey Coat Army meant that he was related to junior brothers Wafan. Making the temple so embarrassed was undoubtedly something that the Sword God's faction was happy to see. As for mentioning Philip, I also admire him. If the fighting energy channel in the body was really developed by him, then it's enough for me to admire him, Wu Ding said indifferently. Then, under Haita's shocked gaze, he raised his head and sighed. Alas, Philip, this bastard grandson, has never let me be at ease. I didn't expect that he would make such an interesting friend. Judging from the context, this grandson obviously didn't sound like an insult. In other words, the sword god Wu Ding was actually the playboy Philip's grandfather. Well, if Tang En was here, besides being speechless about Philip's frightening background, he would probably sigh that this genetic mutation was too powerful. It was completely the rhythm of a tiger father and a dog son. When it came to family, even Wu Ding, who had been unhindered all his life, couldn't help but sigh. After a while, he recovered his calm expression and said slowly, "To be honest, I haven't thought about how to treat Tang En. If it was a few decades ago, I would have killed him without hesitation because he was too dangerous for Bran. If it was a few decades ago, I would have tried my best to invite him up the mountain because he could completely change the pattern of fighting energy and martial arts. It's a pity that I'm old now." He sighed faintly and wished to continue. Because he cherished talents, although he knew that Tang En was very dangerous, Wu Ding still wanted to invite him up the mountain and let him stay in Wu Ding's small residence. But now Wu Ding was old. Although he cherished talents, he was worried that his remaining lifespan wouldn't be enough to suppress Tang En's danger. Therefore, he was very conflicted. "Master," he called softly, his tone was somewhat choked. "Forget it, it's useless to think too much." Wu Ding patted the shoulder of Haita, who had his head lowered and his fists clenched. His expression was still calm. "It won't be too late to make a decision after we meet him." Before he finished speaking, he frowned and turned to look towards the north. Haita also seemed to feel something in an instant. He also looked up and paused. His expression changed. "Junior brother fought with someone?" You're tuning in to the Phoenix Knights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.